creation of the 12th Legion emerged from the crucible of Terra's final wars, when the Emperor's vision of unity demanded warriors capable of the most savage forms of warfare. Unlike their brother legions, whose recruitment drew from specific Terran cultures or geographic regions, the War Hounds were forged from the dregs of humanity's most violent corners. Their gene seed was implanted into candidates pulled from the fighting pits of Europa's underhives, the feral gangers of the Indonesic block's rad wastes, and the cannibalistic tribes that haunted the ruins of the American hive sprawls. The selection process itself reflected the Legion's intended purpose. Potential recruits were not merely tested for physical prowess or genetic compatibility, but were subjected to trials that would have been considered barbaric even by the standards of the Unification Wars. Candidates were thrown into gladiatorial combat against seasoned warriors, forced to fight with improvised weapons in the darkness of Terra's deepest tunnels, and made to survive in the irradiated wastelands surrounding the palace with nothing but their wits and bare hands. Those who emerged from these ordeals bore scars that marked them as survivors of humanity's most primal struggles. The Legion's early tactical doctrine centered on what Imperial strategists termed aggressive shock assault. Where other legions might deploy in coordinated formations with supporting elements, the War Hounds specialized in direct frontal assaults that relied on overwhelming violence and psychological impact. Their battle plate bore reinforced vambraces and knuckle guards, modifications that spoke to their preference for close-quarters brutality. Standard-issue chainswords were common throughout their ranks, but many War Hounds favored combat knives, power mauls, and even improvised weapons that allowed them to engage enemies at arm's length. During the siege of the Caucasus Wastes, the War Hounds demonstrated the effectiveness of their approach against the tech barbarian clans that had fortified themselves in the region's mountain passes. While the 14th Legion deployed heavy artillery to reduce the enemy positions from range, the War Hounds launched themselves directly at the fortified gates. They scaled the walls under heavy fire, their modified armor absorbing impacts that would have felled other warriors, and carved through the defenders with a savagery that left even their allies unsettled. The battle lasted 3 days, and by its end, the War Hounds had taken casualties that other legions would have considered catastrophic, yet they had achieved their objective with a speed that impressed even the Emperor's most demanding strategists. The Legion's reputation for urban warfare developed during the protracted campaign to secure the Albion hive cities. These sprawling urban centers presented unique challenges, with their maze-like layouts, civilian populations, and defenders who knew every tunnel and maintenance shaft. The War Hounds adapted by abandoning conventional squad formations in favor of smaller, more aggressive hunter-killer teams. These units would penetrate deep into enemy territory, striking at command posts and supply depots with surgical precision before melting back into the urban landscape. Their success in the Albion campaign stemmed from their willingness to engage in the kind of warfare that other legions found distasteful. They fought in sewers filled with toxic waste, battled through hab blocks where every room might contain an ambush, and pursued fleeing enemies through ventilation systems barely wide enough for a human body. The War Hounds embraced this environment, their enhanced physiology allowing them to function in conditions that would incapacitate normal humans. They could track enemies by scent through the chemical fog that shrouded the lower levels, fight effectively in complete darkness, and maintain combat effectiveness even when wounded in ways that would cripple other warriors. The early command structure of the War Hounds reflected their unique recruitment patterns and tactical specializations. Unlike legions that maintained rigid hierarchies based on Terran military traditions, the War Hounds developed a system that resembled the gladiatorial schools from which many of their recruits had emerged. Company captains were chosen not through political appointment or strategic acumen, but through ritual combat that tested their ability to lead from the front. These contests were not mere ceremonies, but genuine fights that could result in serious injury or death. Captain Khorne of the 8th Assault Company exemplified this tradition. A former pit fighter from the Boreal slums, he had earned his position by defeating 7 challengers in a single night, using nothing but a combat knife against opponents armed with power weapons. His scarred face and cybernetic left eye bore testament to the violence of his ascension, but under his leadership, the 8th Company became one of the Legion's most effective units. Khorne's tactical philosophy emphasized speed and aggression over careful planning, an approach that resonated throughout the Legion's officer corps. The gladiatorial traditions that would later define the World Eaters began as practical training exercises during the Legion's early years. Terran-born officers recognized that their warriors' backgrounds in pit fighting could be channeled into effective combat training. What started as informal sparring sessions evolved into elaborate tournaments that served multiple purposes within the Legion's culture. These contests identified natural leaders, maintained combat readiness during periods of relative peace, and provided entertainment for warriors who had known little but violence since childhood. The fighting pits constructed aboard the Legion's vessels became centers of social activity. Warriors would gather to watch their brothers compete, placing bets on the outcomes and analyzing the techniques displayed. Veterans would mentor younger Astartes, passing down knowledge gained in the fighting pits of Terra or the battlefields of the Unification Wars. These gatherings fostered a sense of brotherhood that transcended the formal command structure, creating bonds forged in shared violence and mutual respect for combat prowess. The Emperor's vision for the 12th Legion was precisely calculated to fill a specific role within his grand strategy. While other legions were designed for specialized warfare or particular tactical niches, the War Hounds were intended as the ultimate shock troops. Their purpose was to break enemy formations through sheer ferocity, to serve as the tip of the spear in assaults where conventional tactics would fail. The Emperor understood that some battles could only be won through overwhelming violence applied at the crucial moment, and the War Hounds were his instrument for such occasions. This role required warriors who could function effectively under extreme stress, who would advance into enemy fire without hesitation, and who possessed the psychological resilience to engage in close combat against any foe. The War Hounds met these requirements through their unique combination of enhanced physiology, brutal training, and cultural background. They were not merely soldiers, but weapons in human form, shaped by the Emperor's will to serve as the most direct expression of imperial might. The Legion's early engagements demonstrated their effectiveness in this role. During the assault on the Ethnarch strongholds in the Himalaysian peaks, the War Hounds spearheaded attacks against positions that had withstood siege for months. Their willingness to accept casualties that other commanders would have deemed unacceptable allowed them to maintain momentum in assaults that might otherwise have stalled. They would charge through minefields, scale fortress walls under heavy fire, and engage enemy champions in single combat to break the morale of defending forces. The tactical doctrine that emerged from these early campaigns emphasized the psychological impact of the War Hounds' presence on the battlefield. Enemy forces that might have stood firm against conventional assault troops would break when faced with warriors who seemed to welcome violence for its own sake. The sight of War Hounds advancing through their own casualties, their armor scarred and bloodied but their advance unrelenting, proved more effective than artillery bombardments in many situations. This psychological warfare extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Word of the War Hounds' methods spread throughout the remaining pockets of resistance on Terra. Defenders who might have fought to the death against other Imperial forces would sometimes surrender rather than face the 12th Legion. This reputation served the Emperor's purposes by reducing the overall casualties required to complete the unification of humanity's birth world. The Legion's relationship with their Terran-born officers during this period was complex and would prove significant in their later development. These commanders, drawn from the officer corps of the Imperial Army and the nascent Astartes command structure, brought tactical knowledge and strategic thinking that complemented the raw aggression of their warriors. However, they also struggled to fully understand the mindset of troops who had been forged in Terra's most violent environments. This cultural divide manifested in various ways throughout the Legion's early history. Officers trained in conventional military doctrine would attempt to impose standard tactical formations on warriors whose instincts favored individual combat. The War Hounds adapted to these requirements when necessary, but their most effective operations occurred when their commanders allowed them to fight according to their nature. The most successful Terran officers were those who learned to channel their warriors' aggression rather than constrain it. The discovery of Angron on the world of Nuceria marked a turning point that would transform the War Hounds from savage but disciplined shock troops into something far more terrible. When the Emperor's scouts first detected the psychic signature of the 12th Primarch, they found not a conquering warlord or beloved leader, but a broken gladiator slave whose mind had been violated by crude cybernetic implants that turned every moment of existence into an exercise in barely controlled rage. Nuceria was a world that had perfected the art of human degradation. Its ruling class, the High Riders, had built their civilization on the foundation of gladiatorial combat, transforming violence into entertainment and reducing entire populations to chattel for their amusement. The planet's cities were dominated by massive amphitheaters where thousands would gather to watch slaves tear each other apart for the crowd's pleasure. These were not quick deaths, but prolonged spectacles designed to extract maximum entertainment value from human suffering. The gladiator pits of Nuceria operated on a scale that dwarfed even Terra's most brutal fighting arenas. Entire districts of the major cities were dedicated to housing, training, and maintaining the slave warriors who provided the backbone of Nucerian entertainment. The facilities resembled military installations more than simple training grounds, with barracks that could house thousands of fighters, medical centers equipped to keep wounded gladiators alive for future contests, and workshops where weapons and armor were crafted specifically for arena combat. Angron's origins within this system began when he was discovered as an infant, his superhuman physiology immediately marking him as valuable property. The High Riders who claimed him understood that they possessed something extraordinary, though they could not comprehend the true nature of what they had found. From his earliest years, Angron was subjected to training regimens that would have killed normal humans. His handlers pushed his developing abilities to their limits, forcing him to fight multiple opponents simultaneously and testing his capacity for violence in increasingly elaborate scenarios. The gladiator schools of Nuceria employed training methods that combined physical conditioning with psychological manipulation. Slaves were taught to view their fellow gladiators as both brothers in arms and potential enemies, creating bonds of loyalty that could be severed at a moment's notice when the arena demanded combat between friends. This psychological warfare was as much a part of the training as weapons practice or physical conditioning, designed to create warriors who could function effectively in an environment where survival depended on the ability to kill those closest to them. Angron's natural leadership abilities manifested early in his gladiatorial career. Despite the system's attempts to prevent the formation of lasting alliances among the slaves, he began to forge connections with his fellow fighters that transcended the artificial divisions imposed by their masters. His superhuman charisma and tactical brilliance allowed him to coordinate resistance efforts that went far beyond simple rebellion. He understood that the gladiator pits were not merely entertainment venues, but instruments of control, designed to channel the violent impulses of the enslaved population into harmless spectacle. The butcher's nails represented the High Rider's ultimate attempt to control their most valuable asset. These cybernetic implants were not sophisticated pieces of technology, but crude neural interfaces that functioned through direct manipulation of the brain's aggression centers. The devices consisted of a series of metallic protrusions that penetrated the skull and made contact with specific regions of the cerebral cortex, creating artificial neural pathways that bypassed the normal emotional regulation systems. The implantation process itself was a form of torture designed to break the subject's will while enhancing their combat effectiveness. Surgical teams would drill through the skull at multiple points, inserting the nail like probes without anesthetic or proper medical protocols. The procedure was deliberately traumatic, intended to create a psychological association between pain and the activation of the implants. Many subjects died during the implantation process, their brains unable to cope with the massive trauma inflicted by the crude surgical techniques. Once activated, the butcher's nails created a feedback loop, that made violence the only source of relief from constant, gnawing pain. The implants monitored the subject's neurochemical state and would trigger intense agony whenever stress hormones dropped below a certain threshold. This created a physiological addiction to combat, as only the adrenaline and endorphins released during violent activity could provide temporary respite from the artificial torment. The effects of the butcher's nails on Angron's developing psyche were catastrophic. His superhuman intellect, which should have made him a master strategist and inspirational leader, was gradually subsumed by the artificial rage generated by the implants. The devices created a constant state of neurological stress that prevented normal emotional development and made it increasingly difficult for him to form meaningful relationships with others. Every interaction became a struggle against the artificial impulses driving him toward violence. The technical specifications of the butcher's nails revealed the crude brutality of their design. Each implant consisted of a metallic shaft approximately 15 centimeters in length, with multiple branching neural interfaces that made contact with different regions of the brain. The devices were powered by bioelectric energy drawn from the subject's own nervous system, creating a parasitic relationship that gradually degraded neural tissue over time. The implants were designed to be irreversible, with removal attempts typically resulting in massive brain damage or death. The neural pathways created by the butcher's nails interfered with the natural emotional regulation systems that allowed Astartes to function effectively in combat situations. Space Marines were genetically engineered to experience controlled aggression that could be channeled into tactical effectiveness, but the implants created uncontrolled rage that made strategic thinking increasingly difficult. The devices essentially hijacked the subject's fight or flight response, keeping them in a constant state of combat readiness that gradually burned out their nervous system. Medical analysis of the butcher's nails revealed that they functioned by creating artificial synaptic connections that bypassed the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for executive function and emotional control. This meant that subjects experienced raw, unfiltered aggression without the cognitive framework necessary to channel it effectively. The result was warriors who were incredibly dangerous in close combat, but increasingly incapable of complex tactical thinking or long-term planning. The gradual degradation caused by the butcher's nails manifested in several ways. Subjects experienced progressive memory loss, with older memories becoming increasingly difficult to access as the implants created interference patterns in the brain's storage systems. Personality changes were common, with subjects becoming more impulsive and less capable of forming emotional attachments. Physical symptoms included chronic headaches, seizures, and eventual neurological collapse as the brain tissue surrounding the implants began to die. Angron's slave rebellion on Nuceria represented the culmination of years of careful planning and preparation. Despite the limitations imposed by the butcher's nails, his superhuman intellect allowed him to develop strategies that took advantage of the gladiatorial system's inherent weaknesses. He understood that the High Rider's dependence on slave labor created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by a coordinated uprising. The rebellion began in the gladiator pits themselves, where Angron had spent years building networks of loyal followers among the slave warriors. His natural charisma and proven combat abilities made him a natural leader, but his strategic planning went far beyond simple inspiration. He developed communication systems that allowed coordination between different gladiator schools, created weapons caches hidden throughout the arena districts, and established contacts with sympathetic elements among the planet's oppressed populations. The scope of the rebellion extended far beyond the gladiator pits to encompass entire sectors of Nucerian society. Angron understood that the gladiatorial system was merely the most visible aspect of a broader structure of oppression that affected millions of people across the planet. His uprising included not only the slave warriors, but also the technical staff who maintained the arenas, the agricultural workers who fed the cities, and even some members of the lower nobility who had grown disgusted with the excesses of their peers. The tactical brilliance of Angron's rebellion lay in its multi-layered approach to warfare. Rather than simply attempting to overwhelm the High Riders through brute force, he developed strategies that targeted the infrastructure supporting their power. Gladiator teams struck at communication centers, power generation facilities, and transportation hubs, creating chaos that prevented effective coordination of the Loyalist response. Simultaneously, other rebel groups targeted the personal estates of High Rider families, forcing them to divide their forces between protecting their property and maintaining control over the general population. The High Riders' response to the rebellion revealed both their military capabilities and their fundamental weaknesses. Their forces were well equipped and professionally trained, but they had grown complacent after generations of unchallenged rule. The sudden emergence of organized resistance caught them off guard, and their initial responses were poorly coordinated and tactically unsound. However, they possessed significant advantages in terms of air power, heavy weapons, and orbital support that gradually began to tell against the rebels. The final phase of the rebellion saw Angron and his remaining followers trapped in the mountainous region outside Decia, the planet's capital city. The High Riders had deployed their full military might against the rebels, including orbital bombardment platforms and elite military units equipped with the finest weapons their civilization could produce. The rebels found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded, with no possibility of escape or reinforcement. Angron's decision to make his final stand alongside his gladiator brothers represented the defining moment of his character. Despite knowing that the battle was hopeless, he refused to abandon the warriors who had followed him through years of preparation and months of desperate fighting. The butcher's nails, which had been designed to make him a more effective killer, had also created bonds of loyalty that transcended rational calculation. His fellow gladiators were not merely allies, but the only family he had ever known, and he would not leave them to face death alone. The Emperor's arrival on Nuceria coincided with the final hours of the rebellion. His psychic abilities allowed him to locate his lost son despite the chaos engulfing the planet, but what he found was not the triumphant warlord he had expected. Instead, he discovered a broken figure whose mind had been violated by crude technology and whose spirit had been shaped by years of slavery and violence. The Emperor's immediate assessment of the situation revealed the tactical hopelessness of the rebels' position and the certainty of their destruction if the battle continued. The decision to teleport Angron away from the battlefield represented one of the most controversial choices in the Emperor's long campaign to reunite his scattered sons. His psychic abilities allowed him to extract his son from certain death, but the process required leaving Angron's gladiator brothers to face the High Rider's vengeance alone. The Emperor's calculations were coldly logical, prioritizing the survival of an irreplaceable primarch over the lives of mortal warriors, but the psychological impact on Angron was devastating. The teleportation itself was a traumatic experience that compounded the psychological damage already inflicted by years of slavery and neural manipulation. Angron found himself suddenly transported from the midst of desperate battle to the sterile environment of an imperial vessel, his last memory being the sight of his brothers in arms preparing to die in his defense. The abrupt transition from the familiar chaos of combat to the alien environment of imperial technology created a sense of disorientation that would never fully heal. The Emperor's first meeting with Angron revealed the extent of the damage inflicted by the butcher's nails. The devices had created such extensive neural interference that normal communication was difficult, with Angron's responses dominated by artificial rage rather than rational thought. The Emperor's psychic abilities allowed him to perceive the true extent of the neural damage, but even his advanced understanding of human physiology could not devise a method for safely removing the implants without killing his son. The psychological trauma of abandoning his gladiator family created a permanent rift between Angron and the Emperor that would never fully heal. The Primarch's superhuman mind understood the tactical logic behind the decision, but the emotional bonds forged in the fighting pits of Nuceria transcended rational analysis. His brothers had died believing that he had abandoned them, and no amount of explanation could erase the guilt and rage that this knowledge generated. The integration of Angron into the imperial hierarchy proved problematic from the beginning. His experiences on Nuceria had created a worldview fundamentally incompatible with the Emperor's vision of ordered conquest and systematic expansion. Where other primarchs had learned to channel their abilities toward the construction of empire, Angron had been shaped by an environment that rewarded only survival and the destruction of enemies. The concept of building something lasting was alien to someone whose entire existence had been defined by the immediate struggle for survival. The Emperor's attempts to rehabilitate his son revealed the limitations of even his vast knowledge and abilities. The Butcher's nails had created changes in Angron's neural structure that went beyond simple psychological conditioning. The devices had physically altered the pathways through which thoughts and emotions flowed, creating a form of brain damage that could not be healed through conventional means. Every moment of Angron's existence was now defined by artificial pain that could only be relieved through violence, making peaceful pursuits not merely difficult but physically agonizing. The reunion between Angron and the 12th Legion occurred aboard the battle barge Conqueror in the void above Nuceria, where the War Hounds had assembled to witness the return of their Gene Father. The warriors who had spent decades forging themselves into disciplined, shocked troops found themselves face to face with a primarch whose very presence radiated barely contained violence. Angron's first inspection of his sons revealed his immediate dissatisfaction with what he perceived as their softness, their adherence to imperial military doctrine, and their lack of understanding regarding the true nature of warfare. The Primarch's initial address to his legion dispensed with the ceremonial traditions that typically marked such momentous occasions. Instead of inspiring speeches about glory and conquest, Angron spoke in harsh, clipped sentences about the weakness he observed in warriors who had never known true suffering. His scarred features, marked by the protruding neural implants that crowned his skull like a grotesque diadem, conveyed contempt for soldiers who fought according to tactical manuals rather than primal instinct. The Butcher's nails made sustained oratory impossible, as the artificial pain they generated required constant movement and aggressive posturing to remain manageable. Within days of assuming command, Angron ordered the construction of fighting pits throughout the Legion's fleet. These were not the training facilities that had existed aboard War Hounds vessels, designed for skill development and unit cohesion, but crude replicas of the gladiatorial arenas that had defined his existence on Nuceria. The pits were excavated from cargo holds and assembly areas, their floors covered with sand that would absorb the blood of combatants. Viewing galleries were carved into the surrounding bulkheads, allowing hundreds of Astartes to witness the contests that would become central to the Legion's new identity. The fighting pit ceremonies that Angron instituted bore little resemblance to the martial traditions of other legions. Combat was not conducted with training weapons or protective gear, but with live blades and powered weapons that could inflict genuine injury or death. The Primarch's own participation in these contests demonstrated his expectations for his sons, as he would descend into the pits wielding massive chain axes and engage multiple opponents simultaneously. His superhuman speed and strength, enhanced by the artificial rage generated by his neural implants, made him nearly unstoppable in close combat. The psychological impact of these gladiatorial contests on the Legion's culture was immediate and profound. Warriors who had been trained to think tactically and coordinate with their battle brothers found themselves competing for individual glory in single combat. The communal bonds that had characterized the War Hounds began to fracture, as Astartes were forced to view their comrades as potential opponents rather than trusted allies. Veterans who had served together for decades discovered that their relationships were being redefined by their performance in the fighting pits. Angron's introduction of the Butcher's nails to his legion represented perhaps the most catastrophic decision in the history of the Astartes. The Primarch's own torment, caused by the crude neural implants that had been forced upon him during his enslavement, created a twisted desire to share his suffering with his sons. He viewed the constant pain generated by the devices not as a curse, but as a form of enlightenment, believing that only through artificial rage could warriors achieve their true potential in combat. The first volunteers for the implantation procedure came from among the Legion's most devoted followers, Astartes who sought to emulate their gene father in every possible way. These warriors underwent the crude surgical procedures aboard the Legion's medical facilities, where apothecaries attempted to replicate the Nucerian technology using whatever technical specifications could be reverse-engineered from Angron's own implants. The operations were performed without proper understanding of the device's function, resulting in a horrific mortality rate among the early subjects. The technical challenges of adapting the butcher's nails to Astartes' physiology proved nearly insurmountable. The devices had been designed for baseline human neural architecture, not the enhanced brain structure of space marines. The Astartes nervous system, already modified by genetic engineering and surgical implantation of various organs, reacted unpredictably to the crude neural interfaces. Many subjects died on the operating table as their enhanced metabolisms rejected the foreign technology, while others survived the surgery only to succumb to massive seizures or neural hemorrhaging in the days that followed. Despite the obvious dangers, demand for the implants spread throughout the Legion like a contagion. Warriors who witnessed the enhanced combat performance of their successfully implanted brothers began to view the procedure as necessary for advancement within the Legion's hierarchy. The artificial rage generated by the devices created berserkers who could carve through enemy formations with unprecedented ferocity, making unaugmented Astartes appear weak by comparison. This created a feedback loop where warriors felt compelled to undergo implantation to remain competitive within their own legion. The apothecaries tasked with performing these procedures found themselves in an impossible position. Their medical training and loyalty to the Legion's welfare demanded that they refuse to conduct operations with such high mortality rates, but direct orders from their primarch left them with no choice but to comply. Many attempted to modify the surgical techniques to reduce the death toll, but their lack of understanding regarding the device's fundamental operation made meaningful improvements nearly impossible. The gradual adoption of the butcher's nails throughout the Legion created distinct factions based on implantation status. Those who bore the devices formed an inner circle around Angron, their shared experience of artificial pain-creating bonds that excluded their unaugmented brothers. These implanted warriors developed their own rituals and traditions centered around the management of their constant agony, including meditation techniques that focused rage into combat effectiveness and pharmaceutical regimens designed to prevent complete neural collapse. The changes in Legion organization that accompanied this transformation were as radical as they were destructive. The careful command structures that had characterized the War Hounds, with their emphasis on tactical coordination and strategic planning, gave way to a more primitive hierarchy based on individual combat prowess. Company captains were increasingly chosen through trial by combat rather than demonstrated leadership ability, leading to command positions being filled by warriors whose primary qualification was their skill with melee weapons. The tactical doctrines that had made the War Hounds effective shock troops became increasingly irrelevant as the Legion embraced close combat above all other forms of warfare. Complex maneuvers requiring coordination between multiple units were abandoned in favor of direct frontal assaults that relied on overwhelming ferocity rather than tactical sophistication. The Legion's equipment loadouts shifted accordingly, with ranged weapons being discarded in favor of chain axes, power mauls, and other implements designed for close-quarters slaughter. The transformation of the Legion's culture extended beyond simple changes in organization and tactics to encompass their fundamental worldview. The War Hounds had possessed a martial tradition that emphasized honor in combat and loyalty to the Emperor, but the World Eaters developed a philosophy that glorified violence for its own sake. Battle was no longer viewed as a means to achieve strategic objectives, but as an end in itself, the only activity that could provide temporary relief from the artificial torment generated by their neural implants. The growing tension between Angron's leadership style and traditional Astartes command structures manifested in numerous ways throughout the Legion. Officers who attempted to maintain disciplined formations found their orders ignored by warriors driven to seek individual glory in combat. Strategic planning sessions devolved into arguments about which units would have the honor of leading frontal assaults, with complex tactical considerations being dismissed as cowardice or overthinking. The marginalization of Terran-born veterans represented one of the most tragic aspects of the Legion's transformation. These warriors had served with distinction during the Unification Wars and the early years of the Great Crusade, their experience and tactical knowledge making them invaluable assets to the Legion's effectiveness. However, their reluctance to undergo implantation with the Butcher's nails marked them as outsiders within their own Legion, their voices increasingly ignored in favor of younger warriors who embraced Angron's vision of warfare. Captain Khorne's own transformation exemplified the changes sweeping through the Legion's officer corps. The veteran warrior who had once been known for his tactical acumen and inspirational leadership became one of the first to volunteer for implantation with the Butcher's nails. The procedure fundamentally altered his personality, transforming a thoughtful commander into a berserker whose primary concern was finding the next opportunity for close combat. His scarred features, already marked by years of warfare, became even more disfigured as the neural implants protruded from his skull like metallic thorns. The Legion's performance in combat operations during this period reflected both the strengths and weaknesses of their transformation. Against enemies who could be engaged in direct assault, the World Eaters proved devastatingly effective, their artificial rage allowing them to maintain combat effectiveness even when suffering casualties that would have broken other units. However, operations requiring subtlety, coordination, or strategic thinking became increasingly difficult as the Legion's command structure adapted to accommodate warriors whose primary motivation was the pursuit of violence. The relationship between implanted and unaugmented warriors within the Legion created a source of constant tension that undermined unit cohesion. Astartes, who had undergone the procedure, viewed their unmodified brothers as weak and unworthy, while those who retained their original neural architecture saw the implanted warriors as madmen who had sacrificed their humanity for artificial strength. These divisions made coordination between different units increasingly difficult, as mutual mistrust replaced the brotherhood that had once characterized the Legion. The medical consequences of widespread implantation became apparent as more warriors underwent the procedure. The Butcher's nails were designed to burn out their subjects over time, creating progressive neural degradation that manifested in memory loss, personality changes, and eventual complete psychological collapse. Legion apothecaries documented increasing rates of seizures, violent outbursts during non-combat situations, and warriors who became so consumed by artificial rage that they attacked their own battle brothers without provocation. The technological limitations of the Legion's medical facilities meant that proper maintenance of the implants was impossible. The devices required regular calibration and component replacement to function safely, but the knowledge necessary for such procedures had died with the Nucerian tech adepts who had originally created them. This led to a gradual degradation in implant function that created even more unpredictable behavior among the affected warriors, as malfunctioning neural interfaces generated random pain signals and artificial emotional responses. The impact of these changes on the Legion's relationship with other Imperial forces was profound and troubling. Allied units that had once been eager to fight alongside the disciplined War Hounds began to request reassignment when faced with the prospect of coordinating with the increasingly unpredictable World Eaters. Reports of friendly fire incidents, unauthorized attacks on civilian populations, and complete disregard for strategic objectives began to accumulate in Imperial military archives. The transformation of the Legion's fleet reflected their changing priorities and tactical doctrines. Vessels that had once been configured for complex multi-theater operations were retrofitted to support the kind of direct assault warfare that the World Eaters preferred. Hangar bays were converted into additional fighting pits, while strategic planning facilities were abandoned in favor of armories stocked with close combat weapons. The ships themselves began to reflect the brutal aesthetic that characterized their occupants, with skulls and chains decorating bulkheads that had once displayed imperial eagles and tactical displays. The World Eater's first major campaign under Angron's leadership came during the compliance action against the Genna system, a cluster of heavily fortified worlds whose ruling council had rejected imperial overtures for peaceful integration. The system's defenders had prepared elaborate defensive networks spanning multiple planets, with interlocking fields of fire and coordinated fleet movements designed to repel any conventional assault. Imperial strategists had projected a lengthy siege campaign requiring careful coordination between multiple Legion elements and extensive naval support. Angron's tactical approach dispensed with such complexities entirely. The World Eater's fleet translated directly into the heart of the system, ignoring the defensive perimeter that had been established around the outer planets. Drop pods launched while the ships were still under heavy fire, their occupants eager to engage the enemy regardless of tactical disadvantage. The Primarch himself led the assault on Genna Prime's orbital defense platforms, his chain axes carving through bulkheads and defenders with equal ease as his warriors followed in a tide of ceramite and blood. The effectiveness of this direct approach surprised even veteran Imperial commanders who had grown accustomed to the World Eater's brutal methods. The defenders of Genna Prime had prepared for a siege that would unfold over months, with carefully planned fallback positions and supply lines designed to sustain prolonged resistance. They had not anticipated an enemy that would simply ignore defensive preparations and hurl itself directly at the strongest points of their fortifications. The psychological impact of World Eater's assault troops materializing in the heart of supposedly secure facilities proved as devastating as their physical capabilities. The urban warfare that characterized the Genna campaign played to the Legion's evolving strengths in close-quarters combat. The system's primary cities were maze-like constructions built into artificial canyon networks, with narrow streets and multi-level structures that channeled attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. Previous Imperial forces had struggled with these environments, finding their heavy weapons and vehicle support neutralized by the confined spaces and overlapping defensive positions. The World Eaters adapted to these conditions by abandoning conventional assault tactics entirely. Squad-level organization dissolved as individual warriors pursued their own paths through the urban landscape, following the artificial impulses generated by their neural implants rather than coordinated battle plans. This seemingly chaotic approach proved devastatingly effective, as defenders found themselves facing attacks from unexpected directions by enemies who seemed to navigate the city's layout through instinct rather than intelligence gathering. Captain Khorne's 8th Assault Company exemplified this new approach during the assault on Genna Prime's governmental district. Rather than attempting to secure objectives through systematic advances, his warriors simply followed the sounds of combat deeper into the city's heart. The butcher's nails drove them toward the heaviest concentrations of enemy resistance, where the artificial pain could be temporarily relieved through violence. This created a feedback loop where World Eaters naturally gravitated toward the most tactically significant targets, achieving strategic objectives through the pursuit of individual bloodshed. The development of signature weapons during the Genna campaign reflected the Legion's evolving combat preferences and the practical requirements of their new tactical doctrine. Standard-issue chainswords, while effective against most opponents, proved inadequate for the kind of sustained close combat that the World Eaters now preferred. The weapon's relatively light construction made them prone to jamming when used continuously, while their limited reach put warriors at disadvantage against opponents wielding longer weapons. The chain axe emerged as the solution to these limitations, combining the cutting power of chainsaw technology with the leverage and impact force of a traditional axe head. These weapons were significantly heavier than standard chainswords, requiring enhanced strength to wield effectively, but they could cleave through armor plating and structural materials that would stop conventional blades. The psychological impact of the weapons was equally important, as their distinctive sound and the spectacular wounds they inflicted served to demoralize enemies and inspire the weapon's wielder to greater acts of violence. Legion artificers worked tirelessly to perfect the chain axe design, experimenting with different blade configurations and power systems to maximize their effectiveness in sustained combat. The weapons that emerged from these efforts were masterworks of brutal engineering, with reinforced cutting chains that could maintain their edge through prolonged use and power cells capable of sustaining operation even when damaged. Many featured additional modifications, such as spiked pommels for close quarters grappling and reinforced hafts that could serve as clubs when the chain mechanism failed. The chain glaive represented an even more specialized development, designed for world eaters who had achieved sufficient skill and status to warrant custom weapons. These massive two-handed implements combined the reach of traditional polearms with the devastating cutting power of chain technology. The weapons required exceptional strength and coordination to use effectively, making them symbols of elite status within the Legion's hierarchy. Warriors who mastered the chain glaive could engage multiple opponents simultaneously, their sweeping attacks creating zones of devastation that cleared entire sections of battlefield. The forges aboard World Eaters' vessels became centers of innovation as the Legion's artificers competed to create increasingly elaborate and deadly weapons. Standard patterns gave way to personalized designs that reflected their wielders' preferences and combat experience. Some chain axes featured curved blades optimized for decapitation strikes, while others incorporated serrated edges designed to cause maximum tissue damage. The weapons became extensions of their users' personalities, with each warrior developing distinctive fighting styles based on their preferred armament. The bot campaign demonstrated the World Eaters' effectiveness when deployed alongside other legions, though it also revealed the growing concerns that their methods generated among their brother Astartes. The 13th Legion had been tasked with bringing the bot system into compliance, but their methodical approach to siege warfare had stalled against the Defenders' sophisticated fortifications. The arrival of World Eaters' reinforcements promised to break the deadlock, but the coordination between the two forces proved problematic from the beginning. The Ultramarines' tactical doctrine emphasized careful planning and coordinated assaults designed to minimize casualties while achieving maximum strategic effect. Their siege lines had been established according to classical military principles, with supply depots positioned to support sustained operations and artillery emplacements sited to provide overlapping fields of fire. The arrival of the World Eaters disrupted these carefully laid plans, as Angron's warriors showed no interest in conforming to established operational parameters. The tension between the two legions manifested during the assault on Bot's primary fortress city, where Ultramarines' forces had spent weeks preparing for a coordinated attack on multiple objectives. The World Eaters' participation in the planning phase proved perfunctory at best, with their officers showing little interest in discussions of supply lines, casualty projections, or post-victory occupation procedures. When the assault commenced, World Eaters units abandoned their assigned objectives to pursue targets that offered more immediate opportunities for close combat. Robute Guilliman's concerns about his brother Legion's methods were documented in detailed reports that would later prove prophetic. The Ultramarines' primarch observed that the World Eaters' effectiveness in assault operations came at the cost of strategic thinking and long-term planning capabilities. Their tendency to pursue individual glory over unit objectives made coordination with other forces increasingly difficult, while their disregard for civilian casualties created political complications that undermined the broader goals of imperial expansion. The aftermath of the Bot campaign revealed the growing divide between the World Eaters and other imperial forces. The system's compliance had been achieved with unprecedented speed, but the methods employed had left entire cities in ruins and civilian populations traumatized by the experience of World Eaters' occupation. The Legion's warriors showed no interest in the administrative duties that typically followed military conquest, viewing such activities as beneath their notice and incompatible with their need for constant combat stimulation. The compliance of a regatta showcased the World Eaters' evolving tactical doctrine in an environment that should have favored more conventional approaches. The world's defenders had prepared extensive trench networks and fortified positions designed to channel attackers into predetermined killing fields. Previous Imperial forces had struggled against these defenses, finding their advances bogged down in prolonged artillery duels and costly frontal assaults against prepared positions. The World Eaters' response to these defensive preparations demonstrated their fundamental transformation from disciplined shock troops to berserkers driven by artificial rage. Rather than attempting to outflank the defensive positions or reduce them through systematic bombardment, they launched direct frontal assaults that ignored tactical considerations entirely. Warriors charged across open ground under heavy fire, their neural implants making retreat or tactical withdrawal psychologically impossible. The effectiveness of this approach defied conventional military wisdom, as the defenders found themselves overwhelmed by enemies who seemed immune to casualties and tactical disadvantage. World Eaters who suffered wounds that would incapacitate normal warriors continued fighting with undiminished ferocity, their artificial pain receptors making additional injury barely noticeable. The sight of ceramite armored figures advancing through their own casualties while wielding massive chain weapons proved more demoralizing than any conventional bombardment. The urban combat phase of the Aragata campaign revealed the full extent of the World Eaters' transformation into specialists in close-quarters warfare. The planet cities had been fortified according to standard defensive doctrines, with barricaded streets and prepared positions designed to channel attackers into killing zones. These preparations proved useless against enemies who approached urban warfare as an opportunity for individual combat rather than coordinated military operations. World Eaters' assault teams penetrated deep into the urban landscape by following their artificial impulses toward the heaviest concentrations of enemy resistance. This seemingly random approach actually proved tactically sound, as it naturally directed the Legion's warriors toward command centers, ammunition depots, and other high-value targets that generated the most defensive activity. The defenders found themselves facing attacks from multiple directions by enemies who seemed to navigate the city through instinct rather than intelligence gathering. The relationship between World Eaters and Imperial Army units reached a breaking point during the Aragata campaign, as repeated incidents of friendly fire and unauthorized attacks on civilian populations created a crisis of confidence among Allied forces. Imperial Army commanders who had once been eager to coordinate with Astartes forces began requesting reassignment rather than face the prospect of operating alongside the increasingly unpredictable World Eaters. The deterioration in inter-service relations stemmed partly from the World Eaters' growing disregard for conventional military protocols, and partly from the practical difficulties of coordinating with forces driven by artificial rage rather than tactical considerations. Imperial Army units found their carefully planned operations disrupted by World Eaters who abandoned assigned objectives to pursue more appealing targets, while their own positions came under attack from allies who could no longer distinguish between friend and foe in the heat of combat. The psychological impact of witnessing World Eaters' combat methods proved equally damaging to morale among Imperial Army personnel. Soldiers who had been trained to view Astartes as superhuman protectors found themselves horrified by the spectacle of warriors who seemed to take pleasure in inflicting suffering on defeated enemies. The Legion's growing tendency to continue fighting, even after tactical objectives had been achieved, created situations where Imperial Army units were forced to witness unnecessary slaughter of surrendering opponents. The Command Council of the 5th Expeditionary Fleet documented numerous incidents where World Eaters' actions had compromised broader strategic objectives. Their tendency to destroy valuable infrastructure in pursuit of individual combat opportunities made post-compliance reconstruction more difficult and expensive. Their disregard for civilian casualties created political complications that undermined Imperial efforts to integrate conquered populations into the broader structure of human civilization. The growing concern among other primarchs about their brother legions' methods became apparent during the joint operations on Istvan III, where multiple legions coordinated to bring a particularly stubborn system into compliance. The Luna Wolves, Emperor's Children, and Death Guard all contributed forces to the campaign, providing an opportunity for direct comparison between different tactical approaches and combat doctrines. Horus, as War Master, attempted to coordinate the various Legion elements according to their individual strengths and capabilities. The World Eaters were assigned to spearhead assaults against the most heavily fortified positions, where their ferocity and disregard for casualties could be most effectively utilized. However, their performance during joint operations revealed the extent to which their transformation had compromised their ability to function as part of a larger military machine. The coordination meetings that preceded major operations became exercises in frustration, as World Eaters officers showed little interest in complex tactical planning or strategic considerations. Their contributions to operational planning consisted mainly of identifying targets that offered opportunities for close combat, with little regard for how their actions might affect other units or the broader campaign objectives. This created situations where carefully coordinated attacks devolved into chaotic melees as World Eaters units abandoned their assigned roles to pursue individual glory. The other Primarch's observations of Angron during these joint operations revealed the full extent of his transformation since his discovery on New Syria. The brother who should have been a master strategist and inspirational leader had become a figure driven entirely by artificial rage, his tactical contributions limited to identifying opportunities for violence. His interactions with his brother Primarchs were marked by barely controlled hostility, as the Butcher's nails made normal conversation and strategic discussion increasingly difficult. The performance of World Eaters units during the final assault on Istvan III's primary Hive demonstrated both their continued effectiveness in assault operations and their growing inability to function within broader strategic frameworks. Their breakthrough of the enemy's defensive perimeter was achieved with characteristic speed and brutality, but their failure to secure assigned objectives or coordinate with supporting units created gaps in the Imperial advance that enemy forces attempted to exploit. The aftermath of successful compliance actions increasingly revealed the World Eaters' unsuitability for post-conquest operations. Their warriors showed no interest in the administrative duties that typically followed military victory, viewing such activities as incompatible with their need for constant combat stimulation. This created additional burdens for other Imperial forces, who found themselves responsible for tasks that should have been shared among all participating units. The growing concerns about the World Eaters' methods had been accumulating in Imperial military archives for years before they reached the Emperor's attention. Reports from multiple theater commanders documented incidents of excessive brutality, friendly fire against Imperial army units, and the complete abandonment of strategic objectives in favor of individual bloodshed. The Legion's transformation from disciplined shock troops into berserkers driven by artificial rage had created a crisis that threatened the broader goals of the Great Crusade. The Emperor's response to these reports revealed his growing frustration with Angron's leadership and the direction of the 12th Legion. Unlike other Primarchs who had exceeded their operational parameters, Angron's transgressions stemmed not from ambition or political maneuvering, but from fundamental neurological damage that made conventional discipline impossible. The Butcher's nails had created a situation where the Primarch was literally incapable of moderating his behavior or responding to traditional command structures. The decision to deploy Leman Russ and the Space Wolves as instruments of Imperial censure reflected the Emperor's understanding of the unique challenges posed by the World Eaters. Other legions might have been brought to heel through political pressure or strategic reassignment, but Angron's condition made such subtle approaches ineffective. The 6th Legion's reputation for brutal honesty and their Primarch's willingness to confront difficult truths made them the ideal choice for a mission that would require direct confrontation with a brother legion. The intelligence gathered by Imperial observers prior to the confrontation painted a disturbing picture of the World Eaters' operational status. Legion strength had declined significantly due to the mortality rate associated with Butcher's Nails implantation, while the survivors displayed increasingly erratic behavior that made coordination with other Imperial forces nearly impossible. Medical reports documented progressive neurological degradation among implanted warriors, with many showing signs of complete psychological collapse. The Space Wolves' preparation for their mission involved extensive analysis of World Eater's tactical doctrine and combat capabilities. Leman Russ understood that his brother Legion's transformation had created enemies who were potentially more dangerous in close combat than any foe the 6th Legion had previously encountered. The artificial rage generated by neural implants made World Eater's warriors immune to normal psychological warfare, while their disregard for casualties eliminated many traditional tactical advantages. The Wolf King's strategic planning for the confrontation reflected his understanding of both his own Legion's capabilities and the specific challenges posed by opponents driven by artificial bloodlust. The Space Wolves would need to leverage their advantages in ranged combat and tactical coordination, while avoiding the kind of prolonged melee engagements where the World Eater's berserker fury would prove most effective. This required careful positioning and the use of terrain features that would channel the enemy's inevitable charges into predetermined killing zones. The selection of Genna as the site for the confrontation proved tactically significant, as the system's urban landscape provided opportunities for the kind of complex multi-level warfare that favored disciplined troops over berserkers. The ruins left by the World Eater's previous compliance action created a maze of broken structures and debris fields that would complicate direct assault tactics while providing cover for more methodical approaches to combat. The initial deployment of Space Wolves forces demonstrated Leman Russ's understanding of his opponent's psychological state and tactical preferences. Rather than attempting to engage the World Eaters in open battle, where their artificial rage would provide maximum advantage, the 6th Legion established defensive positions that would force their enemies to attack prepared positions under disadvantageous conditions. This approach required patience and discipline that the World Eater's neural implants made psychologically impossible for them to match. The Space Wolves' tactical doctrine emphasized the use of coordinated fire teams and overlapping fields of fire to maximize casualties among attacking forces before they could close to melee range. Their positions were carefully sited to provide multiple fallback routes and mutual support between different units, creating a defensive network that could absorb the impact of berserker charges while maintaining structural integrity. This methodical approach contrasted sharply with the World Eater's preference for direct confrontation and individual combat. Angron's response to the Space Wolves' deployment revealed the extent to which the Butcher's Nails had compromised his strategic thinking capabilities. Rather than attempting to outmaneuver his brother's forces or exploit weaknesses in their defensive positions, he ordered direct frontal assaults that played to the Space Wolves' advantages. The artificial pain generated by his neural implants made careful planning physically agonizing, while the promise of immediate violence provided the only available relief from his constant torment. The first phase of the battle demonstrated the effectiveness of disciplined tactics against berserker fury when properly applied. World Eater's assault troops charged across open ground towards Space Wolves' positions, their chain axes and combat drugs driving them forward despite withering defensive fire. The 6th Legion's bolter volleys and heavy weapons support carved through the attacking formations, inflicting casualties that would have broken most enemy units before they could close to effective range. However, the World Eater's artificial rage made them immune to the psychological effects of heavy casualties, and those warriors who survived the initial defensive fire proved devastatingly effective once they reached the Space Wolves' positions. The chain axes that had become the 12th Legion's signature weapons could cleave through power armor and defensive barriers with equal ease, while the berserker fury generated by neural implants allowed wounded warriors to continue fighting long after they should have succumbed to their injuries. The urban combat that characterized the middle phase of the battle played to both Legion's strengths in different ways. The Space Wolves' tactical flexibility allowed them to adapt their defensive positions to take advantage of the terrain, using building foundations and debris piles to create choke points that channeled World Eaters' attacks into predetermined killing zones. Their coordination between different squad elements enabled complex maneuvers that maximized their firepower while minimizing exposure to close combat. The World Eaters' response to these tactical challenges demonstrated both their continued effectiveness in assault operations and their growing inability to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. Individual warriors and small units proved capable of infiltrating Space Wolves' positions through seemingly impossible routes, their enhanced physiology and disregard for personal safety allowing them to navigate terrain that would stop conventional troops. However, their lack of coordination between different units prevented them from exploiting these individual successes into broader tactical advantages. The performance of Captain Khorne during the urban fighting phase exemplified the transformation that had overtaken the World Eaters' officer corps. The veteran warrior who had once been known for his tactical acumen now fought as a pure berserker, his chain axes carving through Space Wolves' positions with mechanical precision, while his strategic thinking remained focused entirely on finding the next opportunity for close combat. His scarred features, marked by the protruding neural implants that had fundamentally altered his personality, conveyed the single-minded focus that characterized all implanted World Eaters. The Space Wolves' casualties during this phase of the battle were significant, as their defensive positions proved vulnerable to enemies who seemed immune to conventional deterrence. World Eaters' warriors would continue advancing even when suffering wounds that should have been immediately fatal, their artificial pain receptors making additional injury barely noticeable compared to the constant torment generated by their neural implants. This created situations where Space Wolves found themselves engaged in close combat with opponents who possessed significant advantages in both equipment and psychological state. Leman Russ's personal participation in the battle demonstrated his understanding of the psychological dimensions of the confrontation. The Wolf King engaged Angron in single combat, not because he believed he could defeat his brother through individual prowess, but because he recognized that the World Eaters' primarch needed to be contained, while his warriors were systematically eliminated by coordinated Space Wolves fire teams. This required exceptional personal courage, as Angron's combination of superhuman abilities and artificial rage made him perhaps the most dangerous close combat opponent in the galaxy. The duel between the two primarchs revealed the full extent of the damage inflicted by the Butcher's nails on Angron's combat capabilities. While his artificial rage provided tremendous physical strength and pain tolerance, it also eliminated the tactical thinking and strategic awareness that should have characterized a primarch's approach to combat. Angron fought like a supremely skilled berserker rather than a military genius, his attacks driven by artificial impulses rather than calculated strategy. Leman Russ's tactical approach to the duel emphasized defensive techniques and battlefield awareness over direct confrontation. The Wolf King understood that his brother's neural implants made Angron vulnerable to manipulation, as the artificial pain could be exploited to predict his responses and channel his attacks into disadvantageous positions. This required exceptional skill and timing, as any mistake would result in facing the full fury of a primarch driven by uncontrolled rage. The climactic phase of the battle occurred when Space Wolves' forces had systematically eliminated most of the World Eaters' assault troops, while their primarchs remained locked in single combat. The 6th Legion's disciplined fire teams had used their advantages in coordination and ranged weaponry to devastating effect, reducing the World Eaters' numerical advantage through careful target selection and overlapping fields of fire. The survivors of the 12th Legion found themselves surrounded and outnumbered, their berserker fury insufficient to overcome the tactical disadvantages of their position. The moment when Leman Russ achieved tactical superiority over Angron demonstrated the fundamental weakness created by the Butcher's nails. The Wolf King's patient defensive approach had gradually worn down his brother's artificial rage, exploiting the neurological limitations imposed by the crude implants to create openings for decisive strikes. Angron's superhuman physiology allowed him to absorb tremendous punishment, but his compromised strategic thinking prevented him from adapting his tactics to counter his brother's methodical approach. The Space Wolves' demonstration of their ability to eliminate the remaining World Eaters at will provided the psychological leverage necessary to end the confrontation. Surrounded by the bodies of their fallen brothers and facing coordinated fire from multiple directions, the surviving World Eaters found themselves in a position where continued resistance would result in complete annihilation. Even their artificial rage could not overcome the tactical reality of their situation, though their neural implants made surrender psychologically difficult. The aftermath of the battle revealed the full scope of the World Eaters' losses and the effectiveness of the Space Wolves' tactical approach. Casualty reports documented the systematic elimination of entire companies of World Eaters, with survival rates that reflected the devastating impact of disciplined defensive fire against uncoordinated berserker attacks. The 12th Legion's strength had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-battle numbers, while their surviving warriors bore wounds that would require extensive medical treatment. The psychological impact of the defeat on Angron proved even more significant than the physical casualties suffered by his legion. The Primarch's artificial rage had been based partly on the belief that his berserker fury made him invincible in personal combat, but his defeat at the hands of Leman Russ shattered this conviction. The neural implants that had defined his existence since Nuceria now seemed like sources of weakness rather than strength, creating a crisis of identity that would have profound consequences for his future development. The World Eaters' response to their defeat demonstrated the extent to which their transformation had compromised their ability to learn from tactical failures. Rather than analyzing the battle to identify weaknesses in their approach or adapt their methods to counter similar threats, the surviving warriors focused their resentment on external factors that had supposedly prevented them from achieving victory. This inability to engage in meaningful self-reflection reflected the neurological damage caused by their implants and foreshadowed their continued decline. The broader implications of the Night of the Wolf extended far beyond the immediate tactical results of the battle. The confrontation had demonstrated that the World Eaters' transformation into berserkers had created fundamental weaknesses that could be exploited by disciplined opponents who understood their limitations. This revelation would influence Imperial military doctrine and provide valuable intelligence for future operations involving the increasingly unpredictable 12th Legion. The Emperor's reaction to reports of the battle reflected his growing concerns about the trajectory of the Great Crusade and the challenges posed by Primarchs whose personal issues threatened broader strategic objectives. The success of the Space Wolves' intervention had provided a temporary solution to the World Eaters' problem, but it had also revealed the extent to which some of his sons had become liabilities rather than assets to the Imperial war effort. Angron's isolation following the defeat intensified his existing resentment toward the Emperor and the broader Imperial system. The Primarch's damaged psyche interpreted the confrontation as evidence of a conspiracy against him and his legion, rather than a necessary intervention to address their increasingly problematic behavior. This paranoid interpretation of events would prove significant in his eventual susceptibility to chaos corruption, as it provided psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited by entities seeking to turn him against his father. The relationship between the World Eaters and other Imperial forces deteriorated further following their defeat, as news of their humiliation spread throughout the expeditionary fleets. Units that had previously been reluctant to coordinate with the unpredictable 12th Legion now actively avoided joint operations, while Imperial Army commanders expressed open relief at being assigned to sectors where World Eaters' presence was minimal. This increasing isolation created a feedback loop that drove the Legion further toward extremism and resentment. The tactical lessons learned during the Night of the Wolf would prove prophetic for the broader conflicts that would soon engulf the galaxy. The battle had demonstrated that even the most fearsome warriors could be defeated through careful planning and disciplined execution, while also revealing the psychological vulnerabilities created by artificial enhancement and neurological manipulation. These insights would become crucial during the dark days of the Horus Heresy, when former allies would face each other across battlefields throughout human space. The defeat at Genna marked a turning point in Angron's relationship with the Emperor and the broader imperial hierarchy. The humiliation suffered at the hands of Leman Russ had shattered whatever fragile loyalty the World Eater's primarch still possessed, transforming his existing resentment into something approaching hatred. The Butcher's nails, already a source of constant torment, now amplified his sense of betrayal and abandonment. Where once Angron had merely chafed against imperial authority, he now began to view the Emperor's grand vision as a lie designed to perpetuate the same systems of oppression he had fought against on New Syria. The psychological damage inflicted by the confrontation with the Space Wolves extended far beyond simple military defeat. Angron's worldview had been built around the conviction that his artificial rage made him invincible in personal combat, that the suffering imposed by his neural implants was justified by the strength they provided. Leman Russ had demonstrated the falseness of this belief, revealing that disciplined tactics and strategic thinking could overcome even the most savage berserker fury. This revelation created a crisis of identity that the damaged Primarch's mind struggled to process. The World Eater's reconstruction following their losses at Genna proceeded along predictable lines, with the Legion's recruitment efforts focusing on candidates who could survive the increasingly brutal implantation procedures. The apothecaries tasked with rebuilding the Legion's strength had refined their surgical techniques through necessity, reducing the mortality rate associated with Butcher's Nail's installation from catastrophic to merely horrific. New recruits were drawn from the most violent populations the Legion encountered during compliance actions, with preference given to individuals who had already demonstrated exceptional tolerance for pain and violence. The selection criteria for new World Eaters reflected the Legion's complete abandonment of traditional Astartes recruitment standards. Where other legions sought candidates who displayed leadership potential, tactical acumen, or psychological stability, the 12th Legion prioritized raw aggression and the capacity to embrace artificial enhancement. Potential recruits were subjected to trials that resembled the gladiatorial contests of New Syria more than conventional military testing, with survival being the only measure of success. The training regimens developed for these new recruits abandoned any pretense of producing disciplined soldiers in favor of creating pure killing machines. Traditional instruction in tactics, strategy, and combined arms warfare gave way to endless hours of combat training focused exclusively on close-quarters violence. New World Eaters learned to fight with chain axes and combat knives before they ever fired a bolter, their education emphasizing individual prowess over unit coordination. The Legion's fleet became a collection of floating gladiatorial schools, with every available space converted into training facilities designed to produce warriors capable of surviving the artificial hell created by neural implants. Medical bays were expanded to accommodate the casualties generated by training exercises that used live weapons and encouraged genuine violence between recruits. The ships themselves began to reflect the brutality of their occupants, with blood-stained bulkheads and trophy racks displaying the remains of defeated enemies becoming standard decorations. Angron's growing disillusionment with the Emperor's vision manifested in increasingly open criticism of imperial policies and strategic objectives. The Primarch's damaged mind interpreted every aspect of the Great Crusade through the lens of his own traumatic experiences, seeing parallels between imperial expansion and the oppression he had suffered on New Syria. The Emperor's use of overwhelming force to achieve compliance reminded him of the High Rider's methods, while the systematic destruction of non-compliant cultures echoed the gladiatorial system's treatment of rebellious slaves. The philosophical arguments that would later make Angron receptive to Horus's overtures began to crystallize during this period of isolation and resentment. The World Eater's Primarch developed a worldview that portrayed the Emperor as the ultimate tyrant, using the promise of unity and progress to disguise a system of control that was fundamentally no different from any other form of oppression. The Great Crusade became, in Angron's mind, a galaxy-spanning version of the gladiatorial games, with entire worlds forced to fight for the entertainment of a ruling class that viewed them as expendable resources. The Butcher's Nails amplified these philosophical concerns by making rational analysis increasingly difficult. The constant pain generated by the implants created a feedback loop where any thought that did not lead directly to violence became physically agonizing to contemplate. This neurological limitation made it impossible for Angron to engage in the kind of complex strategic thinking that might have revealed flaws in his reasoning or alternative interpretations of imperial policy. The World Eaters' participation in compliance actions during this period reflected their primarch's growing alienation from imperial ideals. Operations that should have focused on bringing worlds into the imperial fold became exercises in destruction and slaughter, with the Legion showing little interest in preserving infrastructure or minimizing civilian casualties. Their methods increasingly resembled the punitive expeditions used to suppress rebellions rather than the careful integration campaigns that characterized successful compliance actions. The relationship between the World Eaters and other imperial forces continued to deteriorate as reports of their excesses accumulated in military archives. Imperial army commanders documented incidents where World Eaters had attacked surrendering enemies, destroyed valuable resources, and shown complete disregard for post-conquest stabilization efforts. These reports painted a picture of a legion that had become more of a liability than an asset to the Great Crusade's broader objectives. The isolation that resulted from these deteriorating relationships created a vicious cycle that drove the World Eaters further toward extremism. Cut off from meaningful interaction with other imperial forces, the Legion developed an increasingly insular culture that reinforced their most destructive tendencies. The gladiatorial contests that had once served as training exercises became the primary form of social interaction, with warriors competing for status through displays of violence that grew progressively more elaborate and brutal. The medical consequences of widespread Butcher's Nails implantation became impossible to ignore, as the Legion's apothecaries documented increasing rates of neurological collapse among their patients. Warriors who had undergone the procedure years earlier began showing signs of complete psychological breakdown, their artificial rage giving way to catatonic states or random violence directed at anyone within reach. The implants were literally burning out their subjects' brains, creating a situation where the Legion's most experienced warriors were becoming liabilities rather than assets. The technological limitations that prevented proper maintenance of the neural implants created additional problems as the devices began to malfunction in unpredictable ways. Some warriors experienced random activation of their pain receptors, causing them to lash out at imaginary enemies or attack their own battle brothers without provocation. Others found their implants stuck in activation mode, trapping them in states of permanent rage that made any form of rational thought impossible. The Legion's command structure adapted to these challenges by developing informal hierarchies based on survival rather than military rank. Veterans who had managed to retain some degree of functionality despite their implants became natural leaders, not because of their tactical abilities, but because they could still communicate coherently with their subordinates. This created a situation where the Legion's most damaged warriors often held positions of authority, their neurological impairment making them unsuitable for complex decision-making, but their survival marking them as successful examples of the World Eaters' ideal. The arrival of Horus's emissaries found the World Eaters at their most vulnerable point, isolated from the broader imperial hierarchy and consumed by resentment toward the system they had once served. The War Master's representatives understood exactly how to approach Angron, framing their arguments in terms that resonated with his traumatic experiences and philosophical grievances. They spoke of liberation from tyranny, of the right to forge one's own destiny, and of the Emperor's hypocrisy in demanding loyalty while offering nothing but suffering in return. The psychological manipulation employed by these emissaries was subtle but effective, playing on Angron's existing paranoia and sense of betrayal. They presented evidence of the Emperor's supposed deceptions, highlighting instances where imperial policy had prioritized strategic objectives over individual welfare. The Night of the Wolf was reframed as an assassination attempt rather than a disciplinary action, while the Emperor's failure to remove the butcher's nails was portrayed as deliberate cruelty rather than technological limitation. Angron's receptiveness to these arguments stemmed partly from his neurological damage and partly from his genuine philosophical objections to imperial policy. The butcher's nails made critical analysis of the emissaries' claims physically painful, while his experiences on Nuceria provided a framework for interpreting their words that confirmed his existing beliefs. The Primarch's damaged mind seized on any explanation that validated his suffering and provided justification for his growing hatred of the Emperor. The World Eater's participation in the early stages of what would become the Horus Heresy began with seemingly routine compliance actions that gradually escalated into something far more sinister. The Legion found itself assigned to operations alongside other units that shared their growing disillusionment with imperial policy, creating opportunities for coordination that had been impossible during their period of isolation. These joint operations provided cover for planning activities that would have been impossible to conduct independently. The selection of Istvan III as the site for the Loyalist Purge reflected careful strategic planning that took advantage of the World Eater's reputation for excessive violence. The planet's rebellious population provided justification for the deployment of multiple legions, while its isolated location made it unlikely that word of whatever occurred there would reach Terra quickly enough to prevent the broader rebellion from proceeding. The World Eater's known methods made them ideal participants in an operation that required the systematic elimination of loyalist elements within the traitor legions. The preparation for the Istvan III operation revealed the extent to which Angron had committed himself to Horus's cause. The World Eater's Primarch showed none of the hesitation or moral qualms that might have been expected when planning operations against fellow Astartes. His damaged psyche had categorized all Imperial forces as enemies, making the distinction between loyalist and traitor space marines irrelevant to his strategic thinking. The artificial rage generated by his neural implants made the prospect of violence against any target equally appealing. The identification of loyalist elements within the World Eaters proved relatively straightforward, as the Legion's transformation had created clear divisions between those who embraced the Butcher's nails and those who retained their original psychological profiles. Terran-born veterans who had resisted implantation found themselves marked for elimination, their loyalty to the Emperor making them obstacles to the Legion's new direction. Company commanders who had maintained disciplined approaches to warfare were similarly targeted, their tactical thinking incompatible with the berserker fury that now defined the World Eaters. The psychological preparation of World Eaters for the coming betrayal required minimal effort, as their artificial rage made them eager for any opportunity to engage in violence regardless of the target. The neural implants that had been designed to create better gladiators now served to eliminate moral reservations about attacking fellow space marines. Warriors who might once have hesitated to turn their weapons on brothers in arms found such concerns overwhelmed by the artificial impulses driving them toward combat. The virus bombing of Istvan III represented the opening move of the Horus Heresy, with the World Eaters playing a crucial role in both the orbital bombardment and the subsequent ground assault. The Legion's fleet contributed to the coordinated strike that saturated the planet's atmosphere with Life Eater virus, their gunners showing no hesitation about deploying weapons of mass destruction against targets that included their own battle brothers. The artificial rage that defined the World Eaters made such considerations irrelevant, as the promise of violence overcame any lingering loyalty to former comrades. The effectiveness of the virus bombing exceeded even the most optimistic projections, with entire cities being reduced to lifeless wastelands within hours of the attack. the World Eaters observed the destruction from their orbital positions with the same enthusiasm they had once reserved for gladiatorial contests, their neural implants interpreting the massive casualties as a form of entertainment rather than a military necessity. The sight of a world dying beneath them provided temporary relief from their constant artificial pain, creating positive associations with the act of betrayal. The subsequent firestorm that consumed the planet's atmosphere eliminated most of the remaining Loyalist forces, but scattered survivors managed to find shelter in underground facilities and reinforced structures. These holdouts represented a tactical problem that required ground forces to resolve, providing the perfect opportunity for the World Eaters to demonstrate their continued effectiveness in assault operations. The Legion's warriors eagerly anticipated the chance to engage surviving Loyalists in close combat, their chain axes and combat drugs making them ideal for the brutal fighting that would characterize the surface operations. The deployment of World Eaters' assault troops to Istvan III's surface revealed the full extent of their transformation from disciplined soldiers to berserkers driven by artificial rage. The warriors who descended in drop pods bore little resemblance to the War Hounds who had once served with distinction during the Great Crusade. Their armor was decorated with trophies taken from defeated enemies, while their weapons had been modified for maximum brutality rather than tactical effectiveness. The neural implants that crowned their skulls like metallic thorns marked them as products of Angron's vision rather than the Emperor's. The ground assault against Loyalist survivors demonstrated the World Eaters' continued effectiveness in close-quarters combat, even as it revealed their complete abandonment of traditional military values. The Legion's warriors showed no interest in taking prisoners or preserving valuable intelligence, their artificial rage driving them to seek only the immediate gratification of violence. Loyalist positions that might have been bypassed or neutralized through siege tactics were instead assaulted directly, with World Eaters accepting horrific casualties in exchange for the opportunity to engage in hand-to-hand combat. The internal conflicts that emerged within the World Eaters during the Istvan III operation reflected the broader divisions that had been developing within the Legion for years. Warriors who had retained some degree of loyalty to the Emperor found themselves fighting not only against designated enemies, but also against their own battle brothers who had fully embraced the path of betrayal. These conflicts were particularly brutal, as they involved opponents who knew each other's fighting styles and tactical preferences intimately. The Loyalist World Eaters who survived the initial virus bombing faced an impossible situation, trapped on a dying world with enemies on all sides and no possibility of reinforcement or escape. Their training and genetic conditioning had prepared them for many forms of warfare, but fighting against their own legion presented unique psychological challenges. The bonds of brotherhood that had been forged through shared combat experience now worked against them, as they found themselves unable to fully commit to destroying warriors they had once considered family. The traitor World Eaters showed no such hesitation, their neural implants eliminating whatever emotional attachments might have interfered with their combat effectiveness. The artificial rage that drove them forward made distinctions between different types of enemies irrelevant, as all targets represented opportunities to achieve temporary relief from their constant pain. This psychological advantage proved decisive in many encounters, as Loyalist forces found themselves outmatched by opponents who seemed immune to the moral qualms that affected normal warriors. The psychological deterioration that had been accelerating throughout the Legion's transformation reached critical levels during the Istvan III campaign. Warriors who had managed to maintain some degree of functionality despite their neural implants began showing signs of complete breakdown, their artificial rage giving way to catatonic states or random violence that endangered both enemies and allies. The stress of combat against fellow Space Marines, combined with the ongoing neurological damage caused by their implants, pushed many World Eaters beyond their breaking point. The medical facilities aboard the World Eaters' fleet became overwhelmed with casualties that could not be treated through conventional means. Warriors suffering from neural implant malfunctions required specialized care that the legion's apothecaries were not equipped to provide, while the psychological trauma of fratricidal warfare created conditions that no amount of medical intervention could address. The legion's strength continued to decline not only through combat losses, but also through the progressive collapse of warriors whose minds could no longer cope with the artificial hell created by their cybernetic enhancements. The tactical effectiveness of the World Eaters during the surface operations on Istvan III remained high despite their internal problems, as their berserker fury proved devastatingly effective against opponents who lacked similar artificial enhancement. Loyalist positions that might have held against conventional assault troops were overrun by warriors who seemed immune to casualties and tactical disadvantage. The chain axes that had become the Legion's signature weapons carved through defensive positions with mechanical precision, while the artificial rage of their wielders made retreat or tactical withdrawal psychologically impossible. The aftermath of the Istvan III operation revealed the full scope of the World Eater's transformation from Imperial servants to chaos-aligned berserkers. The legion that emerged from the campaign bore little resemblance to the disciplined force that had once served alongside other Astartes units. Their ranks had been purged of loyalist elements through violence that exceeded even their normally brutal standards, while their survivors had been further damaged by the neurological stress of fratricidal warfare. The World Eaters had become something new and terrible, a weapon pointed at the heart of the Imperium they had once served. The selection of Istvan V as the primary staging ground for Horus's trap represented a masterstroke of strategic deception that would forever alter the course of the galaxy's history. The barren world, scarred by ancient volcanic activity and dominated by jagged ridgelines that created natural defensive positions, provided the perfect theater for an operation that required the systematic destruction of 3 entire Space Marine legions. The War Master's intelligence network had identified the planet's tactical characteristics as ideal for channeling loyalist forces into predetermined killing zones, while its isolated location ensured that news of the massacre would not reach Terra until the broader rebellion was well underway. The World Eaters' role in the coming operation was defined by their reputation for savage assault tactics and their complete lack of moral restraint following their transformation during the Istvan III campaign. Angron's legion had emerged from that bloody purge as a weapon perfectly suited for the kind of fratricidal warfare that would characterize the drop site massacre. Their neural implants eliminated any hesitation about attacking fellow Space Marines, while their berserker fury made them ideal shock troops for operations that required overwhelming violence applied without regard for casualties. The coordination between the traitor legions during the preparation phase revealed the extent of Horus's planning and the careful consideration given to each force's tactical strengths. The World Eaters were assigned to the second wave of the assault, positioning them to exploit breakthroughs created by the initial landing forces, while their berserker nature would prevent any possibility of mercy or restraint once the trap was sprung. Their chain axes and combat drugs made them perfect for the close-quarters slaughter that would follow the Loyalists' realization of their betrayal. The intelligence gathered on the Loyalist forces revealed the scale of the trap being prepared for the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard. These 3 legions represented some of the Imperium's most capable warriors, with tactical doctrines and combat capabilities that made them formidable opponents under normal circumstances. However, their loyalty to the Emperor and trust in their brother legions created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by commanders willing to abandon all concepts of honor and brotherhood. The World Eaters' fleet took position in the outer system alongside other traitor forces, their vessels loaded with assault troops eager for the coming battle. The Legion's warriors had spent the journey to Istvan V in constant preparation, their fighting pits echoing with the sounds of chain weapons and the screams of combatants as they honed their skills for the massacre ahead. The artificial rage generated by their neural implants made waiting physically painful, creating a pent-up fury that would be unleashed with devastating effect once the battle commenced. Angron's personal preparation for the operation reflected his complete embrace of the role Horus had assigned him. The Primarch's massive chain axes, Gorefather and Gorechild, had been modified with additional cutting teeth and enhanced power systems that would allow them to cleave through the heaviest armor with ease. His scarred features, dominated by the protruding neural implants that had defined his existence since New Syria, conveyed the single-minded focus that characterized his approach to warfare. The Butcher's nails made complex strategic thinking impossible, but they had transformed him into perhaps the most dangerous close combat specialist in the galaxy. The initial phase of the dropsite massacre unfolded according to Horus's carefully orchestrated plan, with the first wave of loyalist forces establishing landing zones on Istvan V's surface, while their supposed allies prepared to deploy in support. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard had no reason to suspect treachery from legions they had fought alongside for decades. Their tactical planning, based on the assumption that they faced only the rebellious elements of the Sons of Horus, who had supposedly taken control of the planet. The terrain of Istvan V's primary landing zone created natural choke points that would prove crucial to the massacre's effectiveness. The volcanic ridgelines that dominated the landscape channeled advancing forces into valleys and defiles, where they could be engaged from multiple directions simultaneously. The Loyalist commanders had identified these terrain features as tactical challenges to be overcome, not recognizing that they were walking into a carefully prepared killing ground where every approach route had been predetermined by their enemies. The moment of betrayal came when the second wave of supposedly loyalist reinforcements opened fire on their brothers instead of the enemy positions they were meant to assault. The World Eaters' participation in this treachery was immediate and devastating, their drop pods slamming into loyalist positions, while their occupants emerged with chain axes already roaring. The artificial rage that drove Angron's warriors forward eliminated any possibility of hesitation or mercy, as they carved through surprised defenders with mechanical precision. The tactical coordination between the traitor legions during the opening moments of the massacre demonstrated the effectiveness of Horus's planning and the careful consideration given to each force's capabilities. The World Eaters served as the primary assault element, their berserker fury driving them deep into loyalist formations, while other traitor forces provided supporting fire and sealed off escape routes. This division of labor maximized the effectiveness of each legion's strengths while minimizing the chaos that might have resulted from uncoordinated attacks. The Iron Hands bore the initial brunt of the World Eaters' assault, their disciplined formations struggling to adapt to an enemy that attacked from unexpected directions with overwhelming ferocity. The 10th Legion's tactical doctrine emphasized methodical advances and coordinated fire support, but these advantages became liabilities when facing opponents who seemed immune to casualties and tactical disadvantage. World Eaters' assault troops carved through Iron Hands' positions with their signature chain weapons, their artificial rage making them oblivious to the defensive fire that should have stopped conventional attackers. Ferrus Manus's response to the betrayal revealed both his tactical brilliance and the impossible situation facing the loyalist forces. The Iron Hands Primarch immediately recognized the scope of the trap and began implementing emergency withdrawal procedures, but the terrain and positioning of traitor forces made organized retreat nearly impossible. His warriors found themselves engaged on multiple fronts simultaneously, with World Eaters' berserkers attacking from one direction, while other traitor forces maintained covering fire from elevated positions. The close-quarters combat that characterized the World Eaters' assault on Iron Hands' positions demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of their transformation into berserkers. Individual World Eaters warriors proved capable of engaging multiple opponents simultaneously, their chain axes cleaving through power armor and defensive barriers with equal ease. The artificial rage generated by their neural implants allowed wounded warriors to continue fighting long after they should have succumbed to their injuries, creating situations where Iron Hands found themselves overwhelmed by enemies who seemed immune to normal battlefield casualties. The Salamander's sector of the battlefield became another focal point of World Eaters' aggression, as Angron's warriors were drawn toward the heaviest concentrations of enemy resistance by their artificial impulses. The 18th Legion's preference for flame weapons and close-range combat should have made them better suited to counter berserker tactics, but the sheer ferocity of the World Eater's assault overwhelmed their defensive preparations. Salamanders who had survived the fires of Nocturne found themselves faced with enemies whose artificial rage made them seemingly immune to pain and tactical considerations. Vulcan's attempts to rally his scattered forces revealed the extent of the tactical disadvantage facing the Loyalist legions. The Salamander's Primarch possessed exceptional strategic acumen and inspirational leadership abilities, but these advantages meant little when facing enemies who attacked from all directions simultaneously. His warriors fought with characteristic determination and skill, but they found themselves gradually overwhelmed by opponents who seemed to welcome casualties as opportunities for closer combat. The Raven Guard's experience during the massacre highlighted the particular challenges posed by World Eater's tactics against forces trained for stealth and precision warfare. The 19th Legion's doctrine emphasized careful positioning and coordinated strikes against specific targets, but the chaotic nature of the betrayal made such sophisticated approaches impossible. Raven Guard units found themselves forced into the kind of direct confrontation that favored their enemies, with World Eater's berserkers charging through carefully prepared ambush positions to engage in hand-to-hand combat. Corax's tactical genius proved insufficient to overcome the fundamental disadvantages created by the surprise attack and overwhelming numerical superiority of the traitor forces. The Raven Guard Primarch recognized the hopelessness of the situation more quickly than his brothers, but his attempts to organize fighting withdrawals were hampered by the terrain and the relentless pressure applied by World Eater's assault troops. His warriors displayed exceptional courage and skill, but they lacked the artificial enhancement that allowed their enemies to continue fighting despite horrific wounds. Angron's personal participation in the massacre represented perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the World Eater's assault. The Primarch carved through Loyalist formations like a living weapon, his massive chain axes leaving trails of destruction that could be tracked across the battlefield by the scattered remains of his victims. The Butcher's nails drove him toward the heaviest concentrations of enemy resistance, where his superhuman abilities and artificial rage made him nearly unstoppable in close combat. The confrontation between Angron and Ferrus Manus became one of the defining moments of the Drop Site Massacre, as two Primarchs faced each other in single combat while their legions fought desperately around them. The Iron Hands Primarch possessed exceptional skill with his signature weapons and tactical acumen that should have given him advantages in personal combat, but Angron's artificial rage and complete disregard for personal safety created a fighting style that was difficult to counter through conventional means. The duel between the two Primarchs revealed the full extent of the damage inflicted by the Butcher's nails on Angron's combat capabilities. While his artificial rage provided tremendous physical strength and pain tolerance, it also eliminated the strategic thinking that might have allowed him to exploit weaknesses in his opponent's technique. Angron fought like a supremely skilled berserker rather than a military genius, his attacks driven by artificial impulses rather than calculated strategy. Ferrus Manus's tactical approach to the duel emphasized his advantages in equipment and strategic thinking, as he attempted to use his cybernetic hands and superior weapons to overcome his brother's artificial enhancement. The Iron Hands Primarch's methodical fighting style contrasted sharply with Angron's berserker fury, creating a battle that showcased two completely different philosophies of warfare. However, the chaotic nature of the surrounding battle made sustained single combat impossible, as both Primarchs found themselves forced to deal with threats from their respective enemies. The systematic elimination of Loyalist forces proceeded with mechanical efficiency, as the traitor legions exploited their advantages in positioning and numerical superiority. World Eater's assault troops carved through defensive positions that had been established to face external enemies, not betrayal from supposed allies. The chain axes that had become the 12th Legion's signature weapons proved devastatingly effective against power armor and defensive barriers, while the artificial rage of their wielders made tactical withdrawal or defensive repositioning psychologically impossible for the attackers. The collapse of loyalist resistance occurred gradually as individual units were overwhelmed by coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Iron Hands formations that attempted to maintain disciplined fire lines found themselves flanked by World Eaters who seemed to appear from impossible directions, their berserker charges breaking through defensive positions that should have been impregnable. Salamander's units discovered that their flame weapons, while effective against individual attackers, could not generate sufficient firepower to stop massed berserker assaults supported by heavy weapons fire from other traitor forces. The final phase of the massacre saw the complete breakdown of loyalist command structures as communication networks were severed, and individual units found themselves fighting for survival rather than tactical objectives. World Eater's warriors, driven by their artificial rage and the promise of close combat, pursued fleeing enemies across the volcanic landscape of Istvan V. The neural implants that had been designed to create better gladiators now served to eliminate any possibility of mercy or restraint, as the berserkers carved through surrendering opponents with the same enthusiasm they showed for active resistance. The casualties inflicted during the Dropsite massacre exceeded even the most pessimistic projections, with entire companies of loyalist space marines being eliminated in a matter of hours. The World Eaters' contribution to this slaughter was disproportionate to their numbers, as their berserker fury and specialized weapons made them devastatingly effective in the close quarters combat that characterized much of the battle. The artificial rage generated by their neural implants allowed wounded warriors to continue fighting long after conventional troops would have succumbed to their injuries, creating situations where single World Eaters could eliminate multiple opponents before finally falling. The few loyalist survivors who managed to escape the massacre carried with them horrific accounts of the World Eaters' conduct during the battle. These reports described warriors who seemed to take pleasure in inflicting suffering on defeated enemies, whose artificial rage drove them to continue attacking even after tactical objectives had been achieved. The neural implants that crowned their skulls like metallic thorns marked them as products of some terrible transformation that had perverted the Emperor's vision of superhuman warriors into something monstrous. The aftermath of Istvan V revealed the complete success of Horus's strategic deception and the devastating effectiveness of coordinated betrayal against unsuspecting allies. The three loyalist legions had been reduced to scattered remnants, their command structures shattered, and their tactical capabilities eliminated as effective fighting forces. The World Eaters had played a crucial role in this victory, their berserker fury and complete lack of moral restraint making them ideal instruments for the kind of fratricidal warfare that would characterize the broader heresy. The psychological impact of the massacre on the surviving World Eaters proved as significant as its tactical results. The Legion's warriors had demonstrated their complete transformation from Imperial servants to chaos-aligned berserkers, their participation in the slaughter of fellow Space Marines marking their final abandonment of the values they had once served. The artificial rage that drove them forward had found perfect expression in the betrayal of their former brothers, creating positive associations between violence and the relief from constant pain generated by their neural implants. The intelligence gathered from loyalist equipment and personnel during the massacre provided valuable insights into Imperial military capabilities and strategic planning. World Eaters who retained sufficient cognitive function to process such information contributed to debriefing sessions that revealed weaknesses in loyalist tactical doctrine and command structures. However, the majority of the Legion's warriors showed little interest in such strategic considerations, their artificial rage making them eager for the next opportunity to engage in close combat rather than concerned with broader military implications. The technological spoils recovered from the battlefield included advanced weapons and equipment that could be adapted for use by traitor forces. World Eaters artificers examined Iron Hands' cybernetic enhancements and Salamander's flame weapons with particular interest, seeking ways to incorporate such technologies into their own arsenal. However, their primary focus remained on perfecting the chain weapons and close combat equipment that suited their berserker fighting style, with little attention paid to more sophisticated military hardware. The medical analysis of casualties inflicted during the massacre revealed the devastating effectiveness of World Eater's combat techniques against even the most heavily armored opponents. The chain axes that had become the Legion's signature weapons proved capable of penetrating power armor at multiple points simultaneously, creating wounds that were difficult to treat even with advanced Astartes medical capabilities. The berserker fury that drove these attacks ensured that wounded enemies rarely received the immediate medical attention necessary for survival, as World Eaters continued attacking until their targets were completely incapacitated. The strategic alliance between Angron and Lorgar Aurelian emerged from the ashes of Istvan V, forged in the immediate aftermath of the drop site massacre, when both primarchs recognized the mutual benefits their legions could provide. The World Eaters had proven their devastating effectiveness as assault troops during the betrayal, but their complete abandonment of strategic thinking and logistical planning created operational limitations that required external support. The Word-Bearers possessed the organizational capabilities and religious fervor necessary to channel the World Eater's berserker fury into sustained campaign operations, while Angron's warriors provided the raw violence needed to break enemy resistance that might otherwise bog down Lorgar's more methodical forces. The philosophical foundation of this partnership rested on shared resentment toward the Emperor's vision of secular imperial truth. Lorgar's humiliation at Monarchia had created a burning desire to prove the superiority of divine worship over the imperial truth, while Angron's traumatic experiences had convinced him that the Emperor represented the ultimate form of tyrannical oppression. The Word-Bearers' embrace of chaos provided a framework for understanding their rebellion that resonated with the World Eater's artificial rage, transforming their neural implant-driven violence into something approaching religious devotion. The target selection for their joint campaign reflected careful strategic planning that took advantage of both legions' strengths while maximizing psychological impact on loyalist forces. Ultramar represented the perfect theater for such operations, as Roboute Guilliman's realm embodied everything the traitor primarchs had come to despise about imperial civilization. The 13th Legion's methodical approach to conquest and administration had created a network of prosperous worlds that served as propaganda showcases for the Emperor's vision, making their destruction a powerful symbolic victory for the forces of chaos. The initial planning sessions between Angron and Lorgar revealed the extent to which their different approaches to warfare could complement each other. The World Eater's Primarch's artificial rage made sustained strategic discussion physically painful, but his tactical instincts for identifying enemy weaknesses remained sharp despite his neurological damage. Lorgar's scholarly approach to military planning provided the analytical framework necessary to transform Angron's insights into comprehensive operational strategies, while the Word-Bearers' intelligence networks supplied detailed information about Ultramar's defensive preparations. The fleet composition assembled for the Shadow Crusade represented a significant portion of both legions' remaining strength, with World Eater's assault vessels being integrated into Word-Bearers' task forces to create combined arms formations optimized for planetary assault operations. The World Eater's ships had been modified extensively since their transformation, with fighting pits and gladiatorial arenas taking precedence over strategic planning facilities. The Word-Bearers' vessels provided the command and control capabilities necessary for coordinated multi-theater operations, their communication arrays and tactical centers compensating for the World Eater's organizational deficiencies. The Shadow Crusade's opening moves targeted secondary worlds within Ultramar's defensive network, avoiding direct confrontation with the 13th Legion's primary forces while establishing forward bases for subsequent operations. These initial strikes demonstrated the effectiveness of combining Word-Bearers' strategic planning with World Eater's assault capabilities, as carefully coordinated orbital bombardments created breaches in planetary defenses that were immediately exploited by Berserker assault troops. The artificial rage that drove the World Eaters forward made them ideal for exploiting tactical opportunities that required immediate action rather than careful preparation. The world of Armatura became the first major test of the Alliance's operational effectiveness, as its heavily fortified cities and disciplined garrison forces represented the kind of defensive challenge that had previously stalled individual Legion operations. The Word-Bearers' preliminary bombardment focused on communication centers and command facilities, creating confusion within the defenders' ranks that prevented coordinated responses to subsequent attacks. The World Eaters' assault troops exploited this chaos by launching simultaneous attacks on multiple objectives, their berserker fury allowing them to maintain momentum even when suffering casualties that would have stopped conventional forces. The urban warfare that characterized the Armatura campaign revealed both the strengths and limitations of the World Eaters' transformation into chaos-aligned berserkers. Individual warriors proved devastatingly effective in close-quarters combat, their chain axes carving through defensive positions with mechanical precision, while their artificial rage made them immune to the psychological effects of heavy casualties. However, their inability to coordinate complex maneuvers or adapt to changing tactical situations created opportunities for defenders who possessed sufficient discipline and firepower to exploit these weaknesses. The Word-Bearers' role during the urban fighting phase demonstrated their evolution from scholarly warriors into fanatic devotees of chaos. Their tactical coordination provided the strategic framework necessary to channel World Eaters' aggression into effective military operations, while their growing religious fervor added an element of ideological conviction that complemented the artificial rage of their allies. The Dark Apostles who had emerged as the Legion's spiritual leaders proved particularly effective at inspiring both Word-Bearers and World Eaters to greater acts of violence through their passionate sermons about the glory of chaos. The systematic destruction of Armatura's civilian population marked a significant escalation in the Shadow Crusades' methods, as both legions abandoned any pretense of bringing worlds into compliance in favor of pure annihilation. The World Eaters' neural implants made them eager participants in such slaughter, their artificial pain receptors finding relief in the act of killing regardless of the target's military significance. The Word-Bearers provided religious justification for these atrocities, framing the massacre of innocents as necessary sacrifices to the dark gods who had begun to manifest their influence through the campaign. The logistical challenges of sustaining a multi-theater campaign across Ultramar's vast distances required careful coordination between the two Legion's support elements. The World Eaters had largely abandoned conventional supply chains in favor of living off captured enemy resources, their berserker nature making them indifferent to comfort or sophisticated equipment. The Word-Bearers maintained more traditional logistical networks, but their growing devotion to chaos had introduced ritualistic elements that complicated standard military procedures. The integration of these different approaches created hybrid systems that reflected both Legion's transformation from Imperial servants to chaos worshippers. The intelligence networks established during the Shadow Crusade revealed the extent of Word-Bearers' infiltration into Ultramar's civilian and military hierarchies. Cultist cells that had been planted years earlier during seemingly routine compliance operations now activated to provide tactical intelligence and sabotage critical infrastructure. These networks proved particularly valuable for identifying high-value targets and coordinating simultaneous attacks across multiple worlds, creating the kind of strategic coordination that the World Eaters could never have achieved independently. The world of Nuceria represented the most personally significant target in the Shadow Crusade, as Angron's return to his homeworld provided an opportunity to settle accounts with the civilization that had enslaved and tortured him. The planet's High Rider ruling class had continued their gladiatorial traditions in the centuries since the Primarch's departure, their amphitheaters still echoing with the screams of enslaved fighters forced to kill each other for entertainment. The World Eaters' assault on Nuceria became a campaign of systematic vengeance that exceeded even their normal levels of brutality. The orbital bombardment of Nuceria's major cities began with precision strikes against the gladiatorial arenas that had defined Angron's youth, their destruction serving both tactical and symbolic purposes. The World Eater's fleet concentrated its firepower on these facilities with an intensity that surprised even their word-bearers' allies, the artificial rage of the Legion's gunners finding perfect expression in the annihilation of structures that represented their primarch's suffering. The High Riders who had once profited from gladiatorial combat found themselves trapped in collapsing amphitheaters as the instruments of their entertainment became their tombs. The ground assault on Nuceria revealed the full extent of Angron's transformation since his enslavement, as the Primarch led his warriors in a campaign of methodical destruction that targeted every aspect of the planet's civilization. The fighting pits where he had once been forced to kill his fellow slaves were demolished with explosive charges, while the training facilities where gladiators had been broken and rebuilt were systematically destroyed. The World Eaters showed no interest in capturing valuable resources or strategic positions, their artificial rage driving them to pursue complete annihilation of everything connected to the gladiatorial system. The High Rider estates that dotted Nuceria's landscape became focal points of World Eater's fury, as these symbols of aristocratic excess represented everything the Legion had come to despise about systems of oppression. The palatial compounds where slave owners had lived in luxury, while their property fought and died for entertainment, were reduced to rubble by chain, axe, and bolter fire. The World Eaters took particular pleasure in destroying the art collections and cultural artifacts that the High Riders had accumulated over generations, their berserker fury finding expression in the systematic elimination of beauty and refinement. The discovery of active gladiatorial facilities still operating on Nuceria provided the World Eaters with targets that resonated deeply with their Primarch's traumatic experiences. The slave warriors found in these pits were not liberated, but rather inducted into the Legion's ranks through the brutal implantation procedures that had become standard practice. Those who survived the Butcher's Nails installation joined their liberators in the destruction of their former captors, their artificial rage enhanced by genuine hatred for the system that had oppressed them. The Word-Bearer's role during the Nuceria campaign focused on documenting the planet's destruction for propaganda purposes and conducting the ritual observances that their growing chaos devotion demanded. The Dark Apostles who accompanied the assault forces used the systematic annihilation of an entire civilization as an opportunity to demonstrate the power of their patron deities, framing the World Eater's vengeance in religious terms that elevated simple violence into acts of divine worship. The blood spilled during the campaign was collected for ritual purposes, while the screams of the dying were recorded as offerings to the dark gods. The psychological impact of returning to Nuceria proved profound for Angron, as the Primarch found himself confronting the physical locations where his personality had been shaped by slavery and torture. The Butcher's Nails made rational processing of these emotions impossible, but the artificial rage they generated found perfect expression in the systematic destruction of everything connected to his traumatic past. The amphitheaters where he had been forced to kill his gladiator brothers were reduced to crater-filled wastes, while the surgical facilities where his neural implants had been installed were obliterated with particular thoroughness. The influence of Khorne began to manifest more clearly during the later stages of the Shadow Crusade, as the Blood God's interest in the World Eater's activities grew in proportion to the slaughter they generated. The constant violence of the campaign created a feedback loop where chaos energies enhanced the Legion's berserker fury, while their artificial rage made them increasingly receptive to demonic influence. Warriors who had once fought purely from neurological compulsion began to experience visions of brass citadels and rivers of blood, their neural implants serving as conduits for the Blood God's whispers. The ritual aspects of warfare that the Word-Bearers introduced to their World Eater's allies gradually transformed the Legion's approach to combat from simple berserker fury into something approaching religious devotion. The collection of skulls and the arrangement of corpses into symbolic patterns became standard practice during planetary assaults, while the chanting of Khornate hymns accompanied the roar of chain weapons. The World Eaters embraced these practices with enthusiasm, their artificial rage finding new outlets in ritualized violence that served both tactical and spiritual purposes. The transformation of World Eaters' equipment and heraldry during the Shadow Crusade reflected their growing alignment with chaos and their increasing distance from imperial traditions. Chain axes were decorated with brass fittings and skull motifs that honored Khorne, while armor was painted in the red and brass colors that would become synonymous with the blood god's servants. The Legion's battle standards were replaced with totems made from the bones of defeated enemies, their imperial eagles giving way to symbols of chaos that proclaimed their new allegiance to anyone who witnessed their advance. The tactical coordination between World Eaters and Word-Bearers forces reached its peak during the assault on Calth, where both legions demonstrated their evolution into effective Chaos Space Marine formations. The Word-Bearers' strategic planning created opportunities for World Eaters' assault troops to achieve maximum impact, while the Berserker fury of Angron's warriors provided the shock value necessary to break enemy resistance at crucial moments. The artificial rage that had once been viewed as a tactical limitation now served as a force multiplier that enhanced the effectiveness of carefully planned operations. The development of combined arms tactics that incorporated both Legion's strengths required extensive coordination between officers who had undergone fundamental transformations since the beginning of the Heresy. World Eaters captains who retained sufficient cognitive function to participate in tactical planning worked alongside Word-Bearers commanders to create operational frameworks that maximized the berserker fury of assault troops while maintaining strategic coherence. These hybrid approaches to warfare represented a new form of military doctrine that combined the systematic approach of traditional Astartes operations with the unpredictable violence of chaos-enhanced warriors. The Shadow Crusade's impact on Ultramar extended far beyond simple military conquest, as the systematic destruction of entire worlds served to demonstrate the futility of resistance against chaos. The World Eater's berserker fury, channeled through Word-Bearers' strategic planning, created a campaign of annihilation that left no doubt about the traitor Legion's commitment to total war. The artificial rage that drove Angron's warriors forward had found perfect expression in the service of the Dark Gods, transforming neural implant-driven violence into religious devotion that would define the Legion's character for millennia to come. The culmination of the Shadow Crusade brought Angron and his World Eaters to a moment that would forever alter not just their Legion, but the very nature of warfare in the galaxy. On the ravaged surface of New Syria, amidst the smoking ruins of the gladiatorial amphitheaters that had defined his tormented existence, the Primarch found himself dying. The accumulated damage from decades of neural implant abuse, combined with grievous wounds suffered during the campaign's final battles, had pushed even his superhuman physiology beyond its limits. The butcher's nails, which had burned through his brain tissue for over a century, were finally consuming the last vestiges of his mortality. Lorgar Aurelian observed his brother's deteriorating condition with a mixture of genuine concern and calculated opportunity. The Word-Bearers Primarch had spent years studying the mysteries of chaos, delving into forbidden texts and communing with entities that existed beyond the material realm. His scholarly nature, once devoted to understanding the Emperor's divinity, had been redirected toward comprehending the true powers that govern the universe. The ritual knowledge he had accumulated during his spiritual journey provided him with the means to save Angron, though the price would be the complete transformation of the World Eater's Primarch into something no longer entirely human. The preparation for the Ascension ritual required extensive coordination between Word-Bearers sorcerers and the surviving World Eaters who retained sufficient cognitive function to understand what was being attempted. The ceremony would need to take place at a location of significant psychic resonance, where the barriers between the material realm and the warp were already weakened by centuries of violence and suffering. The ruins of Decia's primary gladiatorial arena, where Angron had fought his first battles as a slave warrior, provided the perfect focal point for the massive amounts of psychic energy that would be required. The ritual circle constructed by Word-Bearers chaplains incorporated symbols and geometric patterns drawn from the most forbidden texts in their possession, each element carefully positioned to channel the attention of Khorne toward the dying primarch. The brass and iron implements used in the ceremony had been forged in the fires of burning cities throughout Ultramar, their metal infused with the screams of the innocent and the blood of the fallen. World Eater's warriors arranged themselves around the perimeter of the ritual space, their chain axes and combat knives ready to provide the blood offerings that would fuel the transformation. The invocation of Khorne's attention required sacrifices on a scale that exceeded even the World Eater's normal standards of brutality. Thousands of captured Nucerian civilians, including the surviving members of the High Rider aristocracy who had once profited from gladiatorial combat, were brought to the ritual site in chains. Their terror and despair served as psychic fuel for the ceremony, while their eventual deaths would provide the physical offerings necessary to attract the blood god's favor. The World Eaters showed no hesitation in preparing these sacrifices, their artificial rage making them eager participants in the slaughter that would save their Gene Father. The moment of transformation began with subtle changes in the local environment, as reality itself began to warp under the influence of chaos energies. The air above the ritual circle shimmered with heat distortions that had nothing to do with Nuceria's climate, while the ground beneath the participants' feet grew warm with an inner fire that seemed to emanate from some infernal source. The World Eaters present reported hearing distant sounds of battle and the clash of weapons, as if the legendary brass citadels of Khorne were drawing closer to the material realm. Angron's physical form began to change as the ritual reached its crescendo, his already massive frame expanding beyond the limits of even primarch physiology. The butcher's nails, which had tormented him for over a century, became focal points for the transformation as chaos energies flowed through the neural pathways they had carved in his brain. The crude cybernetic implants that had been instruments of torture were transformed into conduits for demonic power, their metallic surfaces taking on a brass-like sheen that reflected the fires of the blood god's realm. The wings that erupted from Angron's shoulders represented perhaps the most dramatic aspect of his physical transformation, their leathery membranes stretched between elongated bone structures that bore no resemblance to any terrestrial creature. These appendages were not merely decorative, but functional, capable of supporting his enhanced mass in flight and serving as additional weapons in close combat. The wingspan required to lift a being of Angron's transformed size created a silhouette that dominated the ritual space, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their source. The changes to Angron's facial features reflected his complete abandonment of humanity in favor of demonic nature. His skull elongated to accommodate enlarged cranial capacity, while his jaw extended to house rows of fanged teeth designed for tearing flesh rather than speech. The neural implants that had once protruded from his scalp like metallic thorns were absorbed into his transformed physiology, becoming part of a crown-like structure of bone and brass that marked his status as a Prince of Khorne. His eyes, once merely scarred by a lifetime of violence, now glowed with the inner fire of the warp itself. The immediate effects of Angron's transformation rippled outward from the ritual site like shockwaves, affecting every World Eater present in ways that reflected their individual relationships with violence and chaos. Warriors who had embraced the butcher's nails most completely found their own artificial rage enhanced by proximity to their transformed primarch, their neural implants resonating with the demonic energies that now flowed through Angron's being. Those who had retained more of their original personalities experienced the transformation as a form of psychic assault, their minds struggling to process the reality of their Gene Father's ascension. The World Eaters who witnessed the ritual reported experiencing visions of endless battlefields where warriors fought not for territory or resources, but for the simple joy of combat itself. These glimpses of Khorne's realm provided them with a new understanding of their purpose, transforming their neural implant-driven violence from a burden to be endured into a gift to be celebrated. The artificial pain that had defined their existence since implantation was recontextualized as a form of communion with their patron deity, each spike of agony becoming a prayer offered to the blood god. The Legion's command structure underwent immediate and dramatic changes as the implications of Angron's transformation became clear to his surviving officers. Captains who had retained enough cognitive function to participate in tactical planning found their strategic thinking increasingly influenced by demonic whispers that emphasized direct confrontation over subtle maneuvering. The careful balance between berserker fury and military discipline that had characterized the World Eaters during their most effective campaigns gave way to pure aggression that acknowledged no tactical limitations or strategic considerations. The organizational changes that swept through the Legion reflected their complete abandonment of imperial military doctrine in favor of structures that better suited their new nature as servants of chaos. Traditional company formations dissolved as warriors gravitated toward leaders who could provide the most opportunities for violence, creating informal hierarchies based on combat prowess rather than military rank. The gladiatorial traditions that had always influenced World Eaters' culture became the primary method for determining leadership positions, with ritual combat replacing strategic planning as the key qualification for command. The World Eaters' participation in the final stages of the Horus Heresy demonstrated their evolution into a force that was no longer bound by conventional military limitations. Their assault troops, enhanced by proximity to their transformed primarch and driven by artificial rage that now carried the blessing of Khorne himself, proved capable of breaking through defensive positions that had withstood months of conventional siege warfare. The chain axes that had become their signature weapons took on quasi-demonic properties, their cutting chains never dulling and their power cells never failing as long as their wielders remained in active combat. The approach to Terra represented the culmination of everything the World Eaters had become since their discovery of Angron on New Syria. The Legion that had once served as disciplined shock troops during the Great Crusade now advanced on humanity's birthworld as berserkers whose only purpose was the shedding of blood in honor of their patron deity. Their fleet, scarred by years of constant warfare and modified beyond recognition from its original imperial configuration, carried warriors who had transcended the limitations of mere space marines to become something far more dangerous. The Siege of Terra provided the World Eaters with targets worthy of their transformed nature, as the Imperial Palace's massive defensive works required the kind of sustained assault that played to their strengths. The artificial rage that drove them forward made them immune to the psychological effects of the fortress's imposing architecture, while their enhanced berserker fury allowed them to maintain combat effectiveness even when suffering casualties that would have broken conventional forces. The sight of World Eaters' assault troops advancing through the palace's outer defenses, their chain axes carving through ceramite and stone with equal ease, became one of the defining images of the siege. The urban warfare that characterized much of the fighting on Terra revealed the full extent of the World Eaters' transformation from imperial servants to chaos devotees. Individual warriors proved capable of clearing entire city blocks through sustained close combat, their artificial pain receptors finding relief in the act of killing that made them eager to seek out new opponents. The neural implants that had once been crude instruments of control now served as conduits for Khorne's influence, allowing the blood god's whispers to guide his servants toward the most tactically significant targets. The assault on the Imperial Palace's inner defenses demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of World Eaters' tactics against even the most heavily fortified positions. Their berserker charges, supported by the demonic presence of their transformed primarch, broke through defensive lines that had been designed to withstand orbital bombardment. The Imperial Fists and other loyalist forces found themselves facing enemies who seemed immune to conventional deterrence, whose artificial rage made them willing to accept any level of casualties in exchange for the opportunity to engage in close combat. The World Eaters' conduct during the siege reflected their complete abandonment of the values they had once served, as their artificial rage found expression in atrocities that exceeded even their previous standards of brutality. The civilian populations trapped within the palace's defensive perimeter became targets for violence that served no tactical purpose beyond satisfying the berserker fury generated by neural implants. The blood god's influence transformed these acts of random violence into religious observances, with each death serving as an offering to Khorne's insatiable hunger for slaughter. The final assault on the Eternity Gate represented the World Eaters' last opportunity to prove their worth as servants of chaos, as the massive portal stood as the final barrier between the traitor forces and the Emperor himself. The Legion's warriors threw themselves against the gate's defenses with characteristic fury, their chain axes and combat drugs driving them forward, despite withering defensive fire from the palace's most elite guardians. The artificial rage that had defined their existence since New Syria found perfect expression in this ultimate test of their commitment to violence. The collapse of the Horus Heresy following the War Master's death left the World Eaters in a precarious position, as their complete transformation into chaos devotees made any possibility of reconciliation with the Imperium impossible. The Legion that had once served alongside other Astartes forces during the Great Crusade now found itself permanently exiled from human civilization, their berserker nature making them unsuitable for anything beyond the pursuit of endless warfare. The neural implants that had been designed to create better gladiators had instead produced something far more terrible: warriors whose only purpose was the shedding of blood in honor of their patron deity. The retreat to the Eye of Terror following Horus's death marked the beginning of a new chapter in the World Eaters' existence, one defined not by grand campaigns or strategic objectives, but by an endless pursuit of violence that would consume the next 10 millennia. The Legion's fleet, battered by the siege of Terra and diminished by horrific casualties, limped toward the great warp storm that had become sanctuary for the defeated traitor forces. Their vessels, already scarred beyond recognition from years of constant warfare, bore the additional damage of desperate fighting withdrawals as Imperial forces pressed their advantage in the wake of the Heresy's collapse. The transition from the material realm into the Eye of Terror proved traumatic even for warriors who had already undergone fundamental transformation through chaos corruption. The World Eaters found themselves entering a realm where the normal laws of physics held no sway, where time flowed in impossible directions and space folded back upon itself in ways that defied comprehension. The warp-touched environment of the Eye created conditions that amplified the artificial rage generated by their neural implants, turning already unstable warriors into berserkers whose fury exceeded anything they had experienced during the Heresy. The demon worlds that became the World Eaters' new homes reflected the violent nature of their inhabitants, with landscapes shaped by millennia of constant warfare and bloodshed. These planets existed in states of perpetual conflict, their surfaces scarred by battles that had raged for centuries without resolution or purpose beyond the shedding of blood. The skies burned with unnatural fires that cast everything in shades of red and brass, while the very air carried the metallic taste of spilled gore and the distant sound of clashing weapons. The adaptation to life within the Eye of Terror required the World Eaters to abandon whatever remained of their imperial military structure in favor of organizational systems that better suited their transformed nature. The careful hierarchies and tactical doctrines that had once characterized even their most degraded operations gave way to pure anarchy, with individual warriors following whoever could provide the most opportunities for violence. The neural implants that had already compromised their ability to think strategically now made long-term planning physically impossible, as any thought that did not lead directly to combat generated artificial pain that could only be relieved through immediate action. The gradual fragmentation of the Legion into smaller warbands began almost immediately upon their arrival in the Eye, as the artificial rage generated by Butcher's Nail's implants made sustained cooperation between large groups increasingly difficult. Warriors who had once fought alongside each other, as battle brothers found themselves unable to tolerate extended periods in each other's presence, their enhanced aggression creating conflicts that could only be resolved through violence. These internal struggles, combined with the psychological stress of exile and defeat, shattered whatever unit cohesion had survived the Heresy's final battles. The process of warband formation followed patterns that reflected the gladiatorial traditions that had always influenced World Eaters' culture. Individual Chaos Lords emerged through ritual combat, their ability to defeat challengers in single combat marking them as worthy leaders regardless of their tactical acumen or strategic vision. These contests were fought with live weapons in arenas constructed from the wreckage of imperial vessels, their sand-covered floors absorbing the blood of defeated warriors, while survivors cheered for combat that provided temporary relief from their artificial torment. The largest and most significant of these emerging warbands coalesced around Khorne the Betrayer, whose transformation during the Heresy had made him the perfect embodiment of World Eater's ideals. The veteran warrior's scarred features, marked by neural implants that protruded from his skull like metallic thorns, conveyed the single-minded focus that characterized all successful World Eater's leaders. His chain axe Gorechild, a relic of the Legion's early campaigns, had been enhanced through decades of constant use and chaos corruption to become a weapon of legendary effectiveness. Khorne's warband, known as the Butcher Horde, attracted World Eaters who sought the most direct path to violence and bloodshed. The warriors who gravitated toward his leadership were those whose neural implants had progressed furthest toward complete neurological breakdown, their artificial rage making them unsuitable for any activity beyond immediate combat. The Butcher Horde's fleet consisted of heavily modified vessels, whose original purposes had been forgotten in favor of configurations optimized for planetary assault and close-quarters fighting. The organizational structure of Khorne's forces reflected the complete abandonment of traditional military hierarchy in favor of systems based purely on combat prowess. Individual warriors earned positions of authority through their ability to kill efficiently and survive prolonged engagements, with leadership roles changing hands regularly as challengers defeated incumbent champions. The warband's tactical doctrine, if it could be called such, emphasized direct frontal assaults against any available target, with success measured not by strategic objectives achieved, but by the amount of blood spilled during each engagement. The Skulltakers emerged as another significant warband under the leadership of Zhufar the Impaler, a former World Eaters captain whose transformation had taken a different path from Khorne's pure berserker fury. Zhufar retained enough cognitive function to engage in basic tactical planning, though his strategies invariably focused on maximizing casualties rather than achieving conventional military objectives. His warbands specialized in siege warfare, their modified vessels carrying massive quantities of ammunition and heavy weapons designed for reducing fortified positions to rubble. The Skulltakers' approach to warfare reflected their leader's obsession with collecting trophies from defeated enemies, with each successful campaign adding to vast collections of skulls and bones that decorated their fleet's interior spaces. These macabre displays served both as offerings to Khorne and as psychological weapons, their presence creating an atmosphere of death and violence that enhanced the artificial rage of the warband's warriors. The sight of thousands of skulls arranged in elaborate patterns throughout their vessels provided constant reminders of the violence that defined their existence. The Devourers represented a third major faction within the fragmented Legion, led by a council of World Eaters whose neural implants had created a form of collective consciousness that allowed them to coordinate their actions despite their individual neurological damage. This unusual arrangement enabled the warband to engage in more complex operations than their purely berserker counterparts, though their tactical planning remained focused entirely on identifying opportunities for close combat rather than achieving broader strategic goals. The formation of these various warbands created a competitive dynamic that drove the World Eaters to ever greater acts of violence as different factions sought to prove their devotion to Khorne through increasingly elaborate displays of brutality. Raids that might once have been conducted for strategic purposes became contests to see which warband could generate the most casualties or collect the most impressive trophies. This internal competition served the Blood God's purposes by ensuring that his servants remained in a constant state of warfare, their artificial rage finding outlets that prevented the psychological collapse that might otherwise result from prolonged inactivity. The technological development of World Eaters' warbands during their early years in the Eye of Terror focused primarily on perfecting weapons and equipment designed for close-quarters combat. The chain axes that had become their signature weapons underwent continuous modification, with chaos-corrupted artificers experimenting with different blade configurations and power systems to maximize their effectiveness against heavily armored opponents. These weapons evolved beyond their original Imperial designs to become quasi-demonic artifacts, their cutting chains never dulling and their power cells drawing energy from the warp itself. The development of Khorne Berzerkers as a distinct warrior type emerged during this period, as world eaters whose neural implants had reached critical levels of degradation underwent additional surgical procedures designed to enhance their combat effectiveness. These operations, performed by chaos-corrupted apothecaries using techniques learned through experimentation and demonic inspiration, involved the implantation of additional neural interfaces that amplified the artificial rage generated by existing butcher's nails installations. The transformation process that created Khorne Berzerkers was horrifically dangerous, with mortality rates that exceeded even the original butcher's nails implantation procedures. Candidates were subjected to surgical techniques that would have been considered torture by imperial medical standards, their brains carved open while conscious to allow the installation of additional neural pathways. Those who survived the process emerged as living weapons whose only purpose was the pursuit of violence, their enhanced artificial rage making them devastatingly effective in close combat while eliminating whatever remained of their capacity for rational thought. The first major incursion launched by World Eater's forces against the Imperium occurred during the 2nd century of the 31st millennium, when multiple warbands coordinated their efforts to assault the Maelstrom Zone. This campaign, known as the Tide of Blood, demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of World Eater's assault tactics even after centuries of exile and degradation. The participating warbands abandoned their usual competition in favor of cooperation that allowed them to achieve objectives beyond the capabilities of individual forces. The Tide of Blood began with simultaneous attacks on multiple Imperial worlds, each assault designed to draw loyalist forces away from more strategically significant targets. World Eater's assault troops proved capable of maintaining their legendary effectiveness in planetary warfare, their chain axes and berserker fury allowing them to break through defensive positions that had withstood conventional siege techniques. The artificial rage that drove them forward made them immune to the psychological effects of heavy casualties, while their enhanced combat abilities allowed individual warriors to engage multiple opponents simultaneously. The Imperial response to the Tide of Blood revealed both the continuing threat posed by World Eater's forces and the tactical adaptations that Loyalist commanders had developed to counter Berserker assault tactics. Space Marine chapters deployed to counter the incursion emphasized ranged combat and defensive positioning, using lessons learned during the Horus Heresy to avoid the kind of close-quarters engagements where World Eaters held decisive advantages. These tactics proved effective in limiting casualties, but could not prevent the massive destruction inflicted by Berserker forces on civilian populations. The Siege of Mordian Prime during the Tide of Blood demonstrated the evolution of World Eater's siege techniques during their exile in the Eye of Terror. The planet's extensive fortifications, designed according to the latest Imperial defensive doctrines, should have been capable of withstanding conventional assault for months or years. However, the World Eater's complete disregard for casualties and their willingness to accept horrific losses in exchange for tactical advantages allowed them to breach the outer defenses within days of beginning their assault. The urban warfare that followed the fall of Mordian Prime's outer defenses showcased the particular effectiveness of Khorne Berzerkers in city fighting, where their enhanced artificial rage and specialized equipment allowed them to clear entire districts through sustained close combat. Individual berserkers proved capable of fighting continuously for days without rest, their neural implants preventing fatigue, while their enhanced physiology allowed them to survive wounds that would have incapacitated normal space marines. The sight of blood-soaked warriors advancing through rubble-strewn streets while wielding massive chain axes became one of the defining images of World Eater's warfare during this period. The Black Crusades launched by Abaddon, the despoiler provided World Eaters warbands with opportunities to participate in larger strategic operations, while maintaining their focus on individual combat and bloodshed. The War Master's calls for unity among the traitor legions resonated with World Eaters leaders, who recognized that coordinated campaigns offered access to targets that would be impossible to assault independently. However, their participation in these grand offensives remained limited by their inability to maintain discipline or follow complex operational plans. The World Eaters' involvement in the First Black Crusade demonstrated both their continued military effectiveness and the challenges posed by their transformation into pure berserkers. Khorne's butcher horde spearheaded several crucial assaults during the campaign, their berserker charges breaking through Imperial defensive lines at key moments when conventional tactics had failed. However, their inability to consolidate gains or coordinate with other forces limited their strategic impact, as they would abandon secured positions to pursue fleeing enemies or seek new opportunities for combat. The assault on Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade represented the culmination of 10 millennia of World Eaters' evolution, as warbands that had spent centuries perfecting their techniques finally faced the fortress world that had stood as the primary bulwark against chaos incursions. The planet's massive defensive installations and elite garrison forces provided exactly the kind of target that appealed to berserker sensibilities, offering opportunities for the sustained close combat that had become the World Eaters' only purpose. The breakthrough at the Cadian Gate allowed World Eaters' forces to demonstrate their effectiveness against some of the Imperium's most elite defenders, as shock troops and Kassakin regiments found themselves overwhelmed by enemies whose artificial rage made them immune to conventional deterrence. The chain axes that had evolved over millennia of constant warfare proved capable of penetrating even the heaviest carapace armor, while the berserker fury of their wielders allowed sustained combat against multiple opponents simultaneously. The independent raids launched by individual World Eaters warbands between major campaigns created a constant source of terror throughout Imperial space, as their unpredictable attacks could strike any world regardless of its strategic significance or defensive preparations. These operations, driven by the artificial rage of their participants rather than tactical considerations, often targeted civilian populations and infrastructure that offered no military value beyond the opportunity to shed blood in Khorne's honor. The raid on Armageddon's hive cities during the 40th millennium demonstrated the continuing evolution of World Eaters' tactics and equipment after 9,000 years of constant warfare. The warband responsible for the attack had modified their assault techniques to take advantage of the urban environment, using grappling hooks and climbing gear to scale hive walls, while their chain axes carved through structural supports to create new entry points. The artificial rage that drove them forward made them indifferent to the defensive fire that rained down from above, while their enhanced combat abilities allowed them to maintain momentum even when suffering casualties that would have stopped conventional forces. The psychological impact of World Eaters' raids extended far beyond the immediate casualties they inflicted, as their reputation for excessive brutality created terror that could paralyze entire sectors. Imperial commanders who might have stood firm against conventional chaos forces would sometimes abandon defensive positions rather than face berserkers whose artificial rage made them seemingly immune to death. This psychological warfare multiplied the effectiveness of relatively small World Eaters forces, allowing individual warbands to achieve strategic impacts far beyond their numerical strength. The technological stagnation that characterized World Eaters' development during the Long War reflected their complete focus on immediate violence rather than long-term strategic planning. While other traitor legions adapted their equipment and tactics to meet changing battlefield conditions, the World Eaters remained locked in patterns established during their transformation in the 31st millennium. Their weapons and armor evolved only in ways that enhanced their effectiveness in close combat, with no consideration given to capabilities that might improve their strategic flexibility or operational effectiveness. The recruitment practices developed by World Eaters' warbands during their exile demonstrated their continued commitment to the principles that had defined their transformation during the Heresy. New warriors were drawn from the most violent populations they encountered during their raids, with preference given to individuals who had already demonstrated exceptional tolerance for pain and artificial enhancement. The surgical procedures used to create new berserkers had been refined through millennia of experimentation, though the mortality rates remained horrifically high due to the crude nature of the neural implants and the psychological stress of the transformation process. The World Eaters who emerged from 10 millennia of exile bore little resemblance to the disciplined War Hounds who had once served the Emperor during the Great Crusade. The 41st millennium found them scattered across the galaxy in dozens of autonomous warbands, each led by Chaos Lords, whose authority rested solely on their ability to provide opportunities for violence. The neural implants that had begun as crude instruments of slavery on New Syria had evolved through centuries of warp exposure and demonic influence into something far more sinister, creating warriors whose every thought was consumed by an artificial hunger for bloodshed. The organizational structure of World Eaters' forces in the current era reflects their complete abandonment of traditional military hierarchy in favor of systems based purely on combat prowess and the favor of Khorne. Individual warbands range in size from a few dozen berserkers to massive hordes numbering in the thousands, their composition determined not by tactical requirements, but by the charismatic pull of their leaders and the promise of violence they offer. These formations exist in a state of constant flux, with warriors regularly changing allegiance based on which lord can provide the most satisfying opportunities for slaughter. Khorne Berzerkers form the core of most World Eaters' warbands, their red and brass armor marking them as the blood god's chosen warriors. These Marines have undergone the most extreme forms of neural enhancement, their butcher's nails installations supplemented by additional cybernetic implants that amplify their artificial rage to levels that would have been fatal to their predecessors. Their helmets, when worn, are fitted with vox grills that emit the mechanical growls and roars that serve as their primary form of communication, the neural damage having rendered normal speech increasingly difficult. The chain axes carried by these berserkers have evolved far beyond their imperial origins through millennia of chaos, corruption, and constant use. Each weapon is a unique artifact, its cutting chains forged from metals that exist only within the Eye of Terror and powered by engines that draw energy directly from the warp. The distinctive roar of these weapons has become synonymous with World Eaters' assaults, their sound carrying across battlefields like the hunting cry of some primordial predator. Many bear names whispered by their wielders in moments of rare lucidity, titles earned through particularly spectacular acts of violence. Khorne Demon engines represent the most terrifying evolution of World Eaters' military technology, combining the Legion's expertise in close combat with the demonic influence that has shaped their development. Juggernauts of Khorne, massive mechanical beasts possessed by lesser demons of the blood god, serve as mounts for the most favored champions. These constructs lumber across battlefields on piston-driven legs, their brass hides deflecting small arms fire, while their riders direct devastating charges into enemy formations. The Brass Scorpion, a super-heavy demon engine that appears alongside the largest World Eaters' incursions, embodies the Legion's philosophy of overwhelming violence applied without subtlety or restraint. These massive constructs, standing as tall as Imperial Titans, advance across battlefields with mechanical precision, while their demonic inhabitants howl for blood through vox amplifiers. Their primary weapon systems focus entirely on close-range devastation, with massive claws capable of tearing through tank armor and demolisher cannons, loaded with shells that fragment into thousands of razor-sharp pieces. World Eaters' Chaos Lords who have survived the Long War represent the pinnacle of berserker evolution, their bodies transformed by millennia of violence and warp exposure into something barely recognizable as human. These champions bear the accumulated scars of countless battles, their power armor fused directly to their flesh through a combination of battle damage and deliberate modification. Many have replaced damaged limbs with mechanical appendages designed for combat, their chain fist attachments and bionic claws serving as permanent weapons that can never be disarmed. The cult of Khorne that has developed within World Eaters ranks goes far beyond simple worship, representing a complete philosophical framework that governs every aspect of their existence. The Eightfold Path of Khorne, a doctrine developed by the Legion's Dark Apostles in collaboration with word-bearers theologians, provides structure for their endless pursuit of violence. This system categorizes different forms of combat and bloodshed, creating a hierarchy of sacred acts that ranges from individual duels to planetary-scale massacres. The ritual aspects of World Eaters' warfare have become increasingly elaborate over the millennia, with specific ceremonies required before major assaults and prescribed methods for collecting and displaying trophies taken from defeated enemies. Skull altars constructed from the remains of fallen foes serve as focal points for these observances, their brass-fitted bone structures creating psychic resonance that attracts the attention of Khornate demons. The blood collected during these rituals is preserved in specially consecrated containers, its eventual use in summoning ceremonies or weapon consecration, representing the ultimate expression of the Berserkers' devotion. The World Eaters' participation in the 13th Black Crusade marked their most significant military operation since the Horus Heresy, as dozens of warbands temporarily set aside their internal conflicts to join Abaddon's assault on the Cadian Gate. The promise of unprecedented violence and the opportunity to face the Imperium's elite defenders drew berserker forces from across the galaxy, their combined strength representing the largest concentration of World Eaters since their fragmentation in the 31st millennium. Khorne the Betrayer's role during the 13th Black Crusade demonstrated the continuing influence of the Legion's most infamous champion, as his presence on the battlefield inspired other World Eaters to acts of violence that exceeded even their normal standards. The veteran Berserker's assault on the Cadian 8th Shock Troops' positions became legendary among Chaos forces, his chain-axe Gorchald carving through an entire company of elite guardsmen in a single sustained charge. The artificial rage that had defined his existence for 10 millennia found perfect expression in the systematic destruction of defenders, who represented everything he had come to despise about Imperial civilization. The breakthrough at Kasser Pardox during the Cadian campaign showcased the tactical evolution of World Eaters' assault techniques after millennia of constant warfare. The fortress city's defensive works, designed to withstand orbital bombardment and Titan-scale weapons, proved vulnerable to enemies who approached warfare as a form of religious devotion rather than military science. Berserker assault troops used shaped charges and melta-bombs to create breaches in the outer walls, their artificial rage driving them forward through defensive fire that should have been lethal to unprotected infantry. The urban warfare that followed the fall of Pardox's outer defenses revealed the particular effectiveness of World Eaters' tactics in close-quarters environments, where their enhanced combat abilities and specialized weapons provided decisive advantages. Individual berserkers proved capable of clearing entire hab blocks through sustained melee combat, their chain axes carving through structural supports and defensive barriers with equal ease. The sight of blood-soaked warriors advancing through smoke-filled corridors while roaring mechanical challenges became one of the defining images of the Cadian campaign. The opening of the Great Rift following the fall of Cadia created unprecedented opportunities for World Eaters' warbands to launch raids throughout Imperial space. The massive warp storm that split the galaxy in half allowed forces that had been trapped in the Eye of Terror for millennia to emerge into real space, their demon engines and chaos corrupted vessels materializing in systems that had known peace for centuries. The psychological impact of these sudden appearances often proved as devastating as the physical damage inflicted, as Imperial commanders struggled to adapt to enemies whose tactics had been perfected through 10,000 years of constant warfare. Angron's manifestations in the current era represent perhaps the most terrifying threat posed by World Eaters' forces, as the transformed primarch's demonic nature, allows him to appear wherever sufficient bloodshed creates the psychic conditions necessary for his materialization. The Demon Prince's presence on a battlefield transforms ordinary world eaters into instruments of destruction that exceed even berserker standards, his aura of artificial rage amplifying their neural implants to levels that would normally prove fatal. His massive form, dominated by brass-fitted wings and crowned with horn-like projections that incorporate his original butcher's nails, serves as a focal point for the violence that defines his legion's existence. The Dominion of Fire campaign that followed the Great Rift's opening saw multiple World Eaters warbands coordinate their efforts to assault the Ultramar sector, their ancient grudge against the 13th Legion providing motivation that transcended their usual focus on immediate violence. The systematic destruction of worlds that had been rebuilt since the Shadow Crusade demonstrated the World Eaters' continuing effectiveness in planetary assault operations, their berserker fury proving capable of overwhelming defensive positions that had been strengthened through millennia of military development. Guilliman's return to active command created a personal dimension to these conflicts that resonated throughout World Eaters' ranks, as many berserkers retained enough memory of the Heresy to recognize their ancient enemy. The Primarch's tactical genius and the disciplined nature of his forces provided exactly the kind of challenge that appealed to berserker sensibilities, offering opportunities for the sustained combat that their neural implants demanded. The battles that resulted from these encounters became legendary among Chaos forces, with individual World Eaters earning names and reputations through their performance against the resurrected Loyalist Primarch's elite troops. The relationship between World Eaters warbands and other Chaos Space Marine forces in the current era remains complex and often violent, as their artificial rage makes sustained cooperation difficult even when strategic objectives align. Alliances with Word-Bearers forces continue to prove most successful, as the 17th Legion's Dark Apostles possess the theological knowledge necessary to channel berserker fury into coordinated military operations. These partnerships typically involve Word-Bearers providing strategic planning and logistical support, while World Eaters serve as assault troops whose artificial rage makes them ideal for breaking enemy resistance. Black Legion forces under Abaddon's command have learned to utilize World Eaters warbands as shock troops during major campaigns, their berserker nature making them perfect for operations that require overwhelming violence applied without regard for casualties. However, these arrangements remain temporary and limited in scope, as the World Eaters' inability to follow complex orders or maintain discipline makes them unsuitable for extended cooperation. The Warmaster's tactical doctrine typically involves deploying berserker forces against specific targets before withdrawing them to prevent the internal conflicts that inevitably arise when World Eaters remain in close proximity to other forces for extended periods. Iron Warriors warbands have developed particularly effective methods for incorporating World Eaters forces into siege operations, using their berserker charges to exploit breaches created by heavy weapons and artillery bombardment. The 4th Legion's systematic approach to fortress warfare provides the strategic framework necessary to channel World Eaters' aggression into tactically significant objectives, while the promise of close combat against elite defenders provides sufficient motivation to maintain berserker cooperation. These partnerships have proven successful in reducing fortified positions that might otherwise require months of conventional siege warfare. The ongoing threat posed by World Eaters' forces to Imperial worlds stems not from their strategic capabilities, but from their complete unpredictability and the psychological terror they generate among civilian populations. A single warband of berserkers can paralyze entire sectors through raids that target seemingly random objectives, their artificial rage making them indifferent to tactical considerations that might influence conventional enemies. Planetary governors who might successfully defend against organized chaos invasions find themselves helpless against enemies whose only purpose is the shedding of blood. Astra Militarum regiments deployed to counter World Eaters' incursions have developed specialized tactics designed to minimize casualties while maximizing the effectiveness of ranged weapons against berserker assault troops. These doctrines emphasize defensive positioning and coordinated fire, using lessons learned through millennia of conflict to avoid the close-quarters engagements where World Eaters hold decisive advantages. However, the artificial rage that drives berserkers forward makes them capable of accepting casualties that would break conventional forces, often allowing them to reach defensive positions despite withering fire. Space Marine chapters tasked with eliminating World Eaters' threats face unique challenges that require adaptation of standard Codex Astartes tactics. The Berserkers' enhanced combat abilities and specialized weapons make them dangerous opponents even for power-armored warriors, while their artificial rage eliminates many of the psychological factors that influence normal combat. Successful operations against World Eaters typically involve careful positioning to maximize the advantages of ranged combat while avoiding the sustained melee engagements that favor berserker tactics. The recruitment methods employed by World Eaters warbands in the current era continue to follow patterns established during their transformation in the 31st millennium, with new warriors drawn from the most violent populations encountered during raids and invasions. The surgical procedures required to create new berserkers have been refined through millennia of experimentation, though mortality rates remain horrifically high due to the crude nature of neural implant technology and the psychological stress of transformation. Those who survive the process emerge as living weapons, whose only purpose is the pursuit of violence in Khorne's name. The technological capabilities of World Eaters' forces remain focused entirely on close combat effectiveness, with no consideration given to strategic flexibility or operational sophistication. Their weapons and equipment have evolved through chaos, corruption, and constant use rather than deliberate development, creating artifacts that exist somewhere between technology and demonic possession. The maintenance of these systems requires ritualistic observances as much as technical knowledge, their function depending on the favor of Khorne rather than mechanical reliability. As the 41st millennium draws toward its close, the World Eaters remain what they have always been since their transformation on New Syria, instruments of pure violence unleashed upon a galaxy that has known nothing but war for 10,000 years. Their berserker fury, amplified by millennia of chaos, corruption, and artificial enhancement, continues to terrorize imperial worlds while serving the blood god's eternal hunger for slaughter. The neural implants that began as crude instruments of slavery have evolved into conduits for demonic influence, creating warriors whose every breath is dedicated to the pursuit of blood and skulls for Khorne's brass throne. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the World Eaters have found their perfect purpose. They are no longer space marines in any meaningful sense, having transcended their origins to become something far more terrible, the living embodiment of violence itself, eternally bound to serve a god whose hunger can never be satisfied. Their chain axes will continue to roar across countless battlefields. Their berserker charges will break through defensive lines that have stood for centuries, and their artificial rage will drive them forward until the galaxy itself burns in the fires of endless war. They are the World Eaters, and they are exactly what 10 millennia of constant violence has made them, perfect servants of the blood god, forever lost to the darkness they have chosen to embrace.